Welcome to meeting number 10 of the Special Joint Committee on the Declaration of Emergency, created pursuant to the Order of the House of March 2nd, 2022, and the Senate on March 3rd, 2022. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 25th, 2021. I'd like to remind all those present in the room to follow the recommendations from public health authorities as well as directives of the Board of Internal Economy to maintain health and safety. Should any technical challenges arise, please advise me, as we may need to suspend a few minutes to ensure all members are able to participate fully. Witnesses should also be aware that translation is available through the globe icon at the bottom of their screen. We have with us today from 6:30 to 8 p.m. the Honourable Chrystia Freeland, Minister of Finance. Welcome. She is joined by officials Isabelle, Jacques, Assistant Deputy Minister, Financial Sector Policy Branch, Jenifer Aitken, Acting Assistant Deputy Minister, Law Branch, Sarah Paquet, Director and Chief Executive Officer, Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada. Minister, we welcome you, and you have 5 minutes for your opening comments. The floor is yours. Please begin.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Chair, members, senators. The work of this committee is very important, and I hope my appearance will be helpful. I am accompanied here today by the Women of Finance. Isabelle Jacques, who is the Assistant Deputy Minister, Jenifer Aitken, Assistant Deputy Minister also of Law Branch, and Sarah Paquet, who is the CEO of Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada. My ministerial colleagues have explained how the Emergencies Act was invoked and carried out. I'm here to speak about the economic costs of the occupation and blockade and the measures carried out under the Emergency Economic Measures Order. It was just 3 months ago that we saw the end of blockades of key border crossings and the occupation of our nation's capital, doing great damage to Canada's economy and to our reputation as a reliable trading partner. Tens of millions of dollars in daily trade were disrupted due to the blockades at border crossings. According to StatsCan, in Coutts, Alberta, about $48 million in daily trade was affected by the blockades. In Emerson, Manitoba, about $73 million in daily trade was affected by the blockades. The blockade of the Ambassador Bridge affected about $390 million in trade each day. This bridge supports 30% of all trade by road between Canada and the United States. The world's confidence in Canada as an investment destination was being undermined. We fought fiercely to protect Canada's privileged trading relationship with the United States during the NAFTA negotiations and in the face of the illegal and unjustified 232 tariffs. We could not allow that hard-won success to be compromised. And we could not allow the livelihoods of Canadian workers to continue to be threatened, just as we were all working so hard to recover from the economic damage caused by COVID-19. Ainsi, le lundi 14 février.
As a result, on the 14th of February, more than 2 weeks after the beginning of the occupations and blockades, the Government of Canada invoked, as a last resort, the Emergencies Act to restore public order. Within the framework of this necessary measure, the Emergency Economic Measures Order entered into force on the 15th of February and introduced several temporary financial measures. Following the end of the blockades on the 23rd of February, the government revoked the Emergencies Act declaration by virtue of the Emergency Measures Act and all temporary measures contained in the Emergencies Decree and the Emergency Economic Measures Order. Madam Chair, I would like to explain the temporary measures under that order and explain why they were necessary and efficient. The order contains measures to limit funding of illegal activities that led to the state of emergency, that is, funding from various organizations and individuals.
Canadian financial service providers. not the Government of Canada, were required, without the need for a court order, to freeze or suspend the account of an individual or business participating in the blockades and to refuse to provide service or to facilitate any transaction related to funding the illegal blockades and occupation. In practice, they did so based either on information they received from law enforcement agencies authorized to be disclosed by the Emergency Economic Measures Order, or information collected from their own internal processes. I'd like to emphasize a very critical point here, that financial service providers made these decisions independently. There was no political direction. As of February 21st, during the period when the order was active, enforcement action under the Emergency Economic Measures Order had culminated in the freezing of approximately 280 financial products, such as savings and checking accounts, credit cards and lines of credit, for a total of approximately $8 million, including $3.8 million from a payment processor. Further, 170 Bitcoin addresses were identified and shared with virtual currency exchangers. Law enforcement agencies were authorized to provide information to Canadian financial service providers. This includes the identity of persons and entities believed to be participating in the illegal blockades. If the law enforcement agencies were satisfied, this disclosure would help financial service providers apply the order. For their part, Canadian financial service providers were directed to review their relationships with anyone involved in the blockades on an ongoing basis and to report the existence of related property and transactions to the RCMP or CSIS. Madam Chair, as the government said at the time, and has proved to be the case, these measures were temporary.
Time is up. We can now go to questions.
Okay.
We'll begin a 5-minute round, starting with Mr. Motz.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here. Will the government waive, being the most senior official that's been here in this committee so far, will the government waive cabinet confidence and solicitor-client privilege in the documents ordered by this committee?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Motz. The government has received the motion and the public service is working on it diligently. I think everyone here appreciates the importance of cabinet confidentiality.
Thank you, which means that we won't get anything probably. Ms. Freeland, senior officials from your department who are with you here today had appeared before our committee this spring, earlier, and yet none of the witnesses you offered could speak to the economic implications that we asked of them from the protests in February. It's convenient for you, considering you put great stock not only in the invocation of the Act, but also in your statements today, claiming economic justifications for declaring a national emergency. Will you make available to this committee the appropriate expert witnesses who can actually defend these claims, these economic claims?
I can quote 2 experts if you'd like right now.
I don't want to quote them. I want them to name them from your department that can come here to this committee.
Well, a couple of experts I think it is worth listening to are Flavio Volpe, President of Canada's Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association.
Oh, sorry.
He was quoted widely in the press.
No, I'm sorry. The question was from your own department. Who from your department can answer specific questions on the economic impact that we asked last time that we couldn't get answers for? And can you provide them? Just a yes or no. If you could give us those witnesses and provide them, that'd be awesome, please.
As a former journalist, Mr. Motz, I always believe in going to primary sources, and another source I would urge you to, whose testimony I would urge you to refer to, is Michigan Representative Elissa Slotkin, who made some very concerning comments during the blockades about the implications for the United States trading relationship with Canada.
Well, again, that doesn't necessarily have any impact on my question or the answer to my question on the expert witnesses from your department. My question then, relating to your department, did anyone in government instruct public servants to conjure up an economic narrative to support its decision to invoke the Emergencies Act?
No.
Was the government informed at any point by public servants that the economic data either didn't exist, that it did not answer the questions you wanted to be answered, or did not produce the results you preferred to hear? And if so, did the government instruct those public servants to generate numbers to back up its claims, regardless of the data problems?
Mr. Motz, I am Canada's finance minister. I was our chief negotiator during the NAFTA negotiations, or I led the negotiations, assisted very ably by Steve Verheuel. I personally had many conversations and read many reports which caused me to be very concerned about the economic consequences of the illegal blockades and occupation. I spoke directly with Canadian business leaders who told me that they were hearing from investors that their confidence in Canada as an investment destination was shaken. I spoke directly from and read the comments of many U.S. political leaders who spoke about how the blockades
I'm
were
sorry, Minister,
encouraging
but
protectionism
my question was
against
about
Canada.
within your own department. So you may not be aware of this, but there's a reason I'm asking that question. Just so that you are aware, your opening statements made some suggestions that, and the word you used was trade disrupted. But Stats Canada has reported that the cross-border trade actually in Ontario and Alberta during the time of the blockade was up 16% compared to last year. So it appears as if, although disruptive and inappropriate and illegal, the blockades of the borders did not have the economic impact that you're suggesting, and that it certainly did not warrant the use of the Emergencies Act in order, as you suggest. One other question I may have. So you said that there's 280 accounts that you froze, around $8 million, you suggest. What caused the government to continue to freeze those bank accounts after the blockades were cleared and the trucks were gone from Wellington?
I have to go back to your previous assertion about the economic damage, Mr. Motz, because I was very gravely concerned about the damage to our trading relationship with the United States and our reputation as a reliable partner. I have to quote Representative Slotkin, who said, "One thing that couldn't be more clear is that we have to bring American manufacturing back home to states like Michigan.
So you're disputing
we have to
Stats
continue the work."
Your 5 minutes is up.
Thank you.
Pardon the disruption, Minister. We'll move to Ms. Bendayan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Minister, thank you for being here. And I believe you were mid-sentence in quoting somebody. Would you like to perhaps finish and provide us with the full quote for the record?
I would. And look, I appreciate many of us here are elected and we have a partisan job to do. But I really want to speak very sincerely as Canada's finance minister and as a person who fought so hard, supported really by our whole country, to maintain that essential trading relationship with the United States. It was clear to me that with each passing hour, our economic reputation with the United States as a reliable trading partner and as a reliable investment destination was being damaged. And I'm going to quote Alyssa Slotkin, a Michigan congresswoman, and this is what she had to say. "It doesn't matter if it's an adversary or an ally. We can't be this reliant on parts coming from foreign countries. The one thing that couldn't be more clear is that we have to bring American manufacturing back home to states like Michigan. If we don't, it's American workers who are left holding the bag." And then she vowed, and I quote, "to continue the work that Michiganders have been pushing for over the last 30 years, bringing manufacturing of critical items back to the U.S. so that we're not dependent on others for our economic security." This is so dangerous to Canada, colleagues. I was deeply, deeply concerned that these illegal blockades and this illegal occupation would provoke a whole new wave of protectionism and deeply erode our trading relationship with the United States. That was a real economic threat. And going back to Mr. Motz's point, reputational harm is not something that you necessarily feel fully in the moment. It's something that you feel in the years ahead. Later on, I'll quote Flavio Volpe, who talked about, at the time, his concerns that going forward, investors would not choose to put their money into Canada because they would quite reasonably say to themselves, there is no guarantee that parts that we build in Canada will be able to freely and easily travel to the United States. I also spoke directly with U.S. government officials. They were very, very worried. And I was very, very worried as well. The measures that we took were serious. And the members of this committee are right to scrutinize them carefully. But I do also want to remind everyone here that the economic harm in the moment and in the weeks, months, and indeed years to come was serious, and it was becoming more serious every single day.
Thank you for that, Minister. And I, too, at the time was extremely concerned, particularly, as I understand it, both at the time and from testimony at this committee, that at the time of invocation of the Emergencies Act, the blockade at the Coutts, Alberta international border was ongoing and would only reopen on February 15th, that the blockade at Emerson, Manitoba was also ongoing and would only open 2 days following the invocation of the Emergencies Act. Surrey, BC, same things, only several days later, and there was a continued threat of further blockades at the Windsor border, which, as you mentioned, Minister, affected about $400 million in trade each day. I would just like perhaps to hear you on the economic importance not only of our country but also for workers. I have read a quote from Dave Cassidy, who's the president of Local 444 of the United Auto Workers Association, which represents workers at the factory in Windsor, who said, our whole economy depends on the bridge being open. If these lines don't run and the workers are sent home, then these working families unfortunately become collateral damage to the protest that's going on at the bridge, end quote. Minister, can you speak to the importance of supporting our Canadian workers at this time?
Minister, just so you know, 10 seconds.
Okay, yes, very important.
Thank you. Mr. Fortin, 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Minister, welcome to our committee. I'm happy to learn that you will produce the documents we have requested. I do understand that some things have to be done by the department, but we were also sworn in to receive confidential documents as well as confidential information, and we cannot carry out that mandate if we do not have all the information or documents we need. So I hope you are also aware of that on your side. So I believe that you have the good faith required to make sure that we receive the documents we need. That being said, I would like to say something. Did you participate in the discussions at the Cabinet of Ministers before the proclamation of the Emergencies Act? We had discussions at the Incident Response Group. This is a group that brings together some key ministers. And you discussed the need for the Emergencies Act, whether it was necessary or not. We discussed the situation. I talked about the economic impacts, serious economic impacts, and we discussed how we could put an end to the blockades and illegal occupation. When did those discussions start or take place? At what time? The discussions of that committee are public, and we published the opinions of every session of that committee. And it's at that committee that you decided to proclaim the Emergencies Act? Since that is information that is already public, it was a very serious decision, one that was taken following a cabinet meeting. I heard you say that the blockade, the occupation of Wellington Street, caused significant damage to the Canadian economy. Could you explain to me how blockades right here on Wellington Street could affect the Canadian economy? Good question. Thank you. I will say that the impact was two-pronged. First of all, there was serious impact on the economy of Ottawa and the Ottawa region, which is important for you as an MP from Quebec. According to an article published by Radio-Canada, it quoted, I'm sorry, Madam Minister, I don't want to be impolite. We really don't have enough time. I don't want you to talk about the article. Maybe my question was not well explained. In your opinion as a minister, why would demonstrations on Wellington Street have an impact on the Canadian economy? What is the link between the two? I don't see it. Maybe it's my problem with my poor level of French, but I will try to explain. You could use the simultaneous translation. Well, it's important. I believe that you agree with me that it's important to speak in French. But what is more important is that you answer my questions, Madam Minister. In any case, there were two types of impacts. First of all, on the impact of the broader Ottawa region, and secondly, on the reputation of Canada. Canada's reputation of Canada as a state that is politically stable. That's very important for investments, and all that was affected by the occupation and the blockades. Tell me, what was done? Because a while ago you said that the act was invoked as a last resort because it was necessary. That's what you said. This is my question. What did you attempt before? Because when you talk about the last resort, you must have tried something that did not work. So what did you initially attempt to put an end to the demonstrations on Wellington or to prevent them? You spoke already to other political colleagues and to the other senior officials of the public service concerning the direct work that was done by people responsible for public security. But I would like to underscore the fact that in my capacity as finance minister, for every day that the occupation continued and the blockades, it was a bad day for the economy. Before the Emergencies Act, Mr. Fortin.
We'll now move to Mr. Green.
Thank you. And I'll say right off the top, welcome, Deputy Prime Minister. You're here both as a Deputy Prime Minister and a Minister of Finance. I have to say that I'm very concerned with the nature of the answers. I'm now the fourth intervention, and I'm not sure that you've brought any additional facts. You have quoted news articles. You're quoting people. You talk about primary sources. I'm going to put to you, we need you here as a primary source. As somebody who supported this, I need to know that the government had within its department, within your department, within your ministry, facts that would meet the economic impacts of the occupation to be significant enough to meet the threshold of a threat to national security as legally defined by Section 2 of the CSIS Act. I'm not talking about feelings. I'm not talking about reputation and how bad we might look in the world. I'm talking about quantifiable facts that your department would have provided for the inevitable invocation of the act. So I'm going to put the question to you directly. What were the economic impacts of the occupation, and were they significant enough to meet the threshold of a threat to national security under Section 2 of the CSIS Act?
Let me be very clear, and with all due respect, I have to...
Those two statements, by the way, they preclude neither of the above.
I'm happy to answer your question if I'm not interrupted. So I do have to start again, sincerely, with all due respect, by disputing the contention that when it comes to the economy, reputation doesn't matter. In fact, Canada's reputation as a reliable trading partner, as a reliable investment destination, as a country with peace, order, and good government, as a country with stable and effective political institutions, these are some of the most precious things we have as an economy, and they are the foundation for our prosperity. And I would direct
That's
you...
not the question I asked you. The question I asked you is, what economic impacts of the occupation did your ministry provide, and what legal opinion was provided that would have met the threshold as defined under Section 2 of the CSIS Act? I'm not talking about pontification. I'm talking about facts here.
Again, I don't believe I'm pontificating. Let me, again, be really, really clear. The economic impact was absolutely, clearly there. The economic impact to the region of Ottawa was clear. The economic impact of actual trade, which was blocked, and the ongoing future economic impact, the harm done to our reputation as a reliable trading partner and investment destination. I had many conversations with Canadian business leaders.
That's not good enough. Madam Chair, look, so there's two things that are happening right now. One, the audio and the feedback is making this very difficult for me to engage. And I don't know if somebody's got a live mic there.
I think you're running two devices.
I'm not.
Okay.
I'm here on my headphones. But it's a very frustrating process when we have such limited time and such evasive answers. What we're looking for out of this committee are specifics, facts of the matter.
Mr. Green, would you like us to suspend to make sure your audio is correct? We will hold your time where you're at.
Please do. Well, how is it now? Is it echoing? It stopped.
It's fine for us on this end, so it appears to be something on your end.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go back to the most basic question. If the Minister of Finance can provide something generated within her department that is not an external reference to an American governor or any external bodies that quantify the threshold under Section 2 that goes beyond reputation. I'm talking about real economic impacts that are quantifiable that her ministry, I would hope, would have generated in some kind of report, some kind of briefing, and if so, would she please provide it to this committee today?
The answer, it's actually when you both speak at the same time that is problematic. Go ahead, Minister.
Thank you. And I have to say, I disagree so forcefully with the premise of the question. Reputational damage when it comes to an economy, when it comes to a trading relationship, when it comes to Canada's
This is just repeating the same answer. You know, look, at the end of the day, we have a job at this committee to get to the heart of the matter. You can reject the premise of the question. All you have to say is that your ministry did not generate any internal information that would be for the good and the welfare of this committee, because that's what I'm hearing right now in the repeating of these answers. So I'm going to move on. It states on February 17th that you had spoken directly with the heads of major banks and the director of FinTech. What was the nature of those conversations? And did banks and FinTech express either support or opposition to any of the temporary measures in the order?
Time is up. Mr. Fortin, may I ask you to take the chair?
La parole est à vous, Madame Boniface.
Over to you, Madame Boniface.
Minister, I would like to zero in on the Ottawa occupation and the effect of the economic measures. As you know, this is an issue that has been raised continually in terms of the link between the Ottawa occupation, particularly, and the measures. So with other tools that were provided through the emergency measures regulations, why were the economic measures needed to disperse the occupation? I'm trying to figure out what the thought process was going into it.
Maybe I'll start, if it's in the spirit of your question, by talking a little bit about the economic damage to Ottawa. Is that okay? So Let me start by pointing out that the City of Ottawa released a report last week detailing the costs of the illegal blockade to the City of Ottawa itself, and they put the cost at $37 million. Larry Andrade, a Deloitte partner, calculated the damages suffered by businesses and employees in the Ottawa area during the occupation period to be between $150 million and $207 million. And the Retail Council of Canada estimated that there were losses of $3 million per day in sales. When it comes to the second part of your question, the thought process, I do want to assure the members of this committee that I am very aware of the seriousness of invoking the Emergencies Act. I'm very aware that that was a big decision. And what I would like to say to you and to Canadians is, as Minister of Finance, the gravity of that decision was also weighed in my mind and in the discussions within our department against the gravity of the economic damage that was being done. And the economic damage that was being done truly was compounded. Every day that it went on, specific damage was being done, but every single day that it went on, that really was a blow to Canada's reputation. It was a blow to every single Canadian who goes out and tries to get someone to invest in the country. It was a blow to every single Canadian who tries to be a supplier to an American partner. And I heard that directly in conversations I had with Canadian business leaders who were getting in touch with me, gravely concerned. I actually heard it from some members of this committee asking me questions in question period who at the time were gravely concerned. And certainly I, of course, was not the only person in the Department of Finance who was working on this. My officials, my political colleagues were all hearing exactly the same thing.
For that, and just quickly, one of the issues that has been raised, certainly at this committee, on the economic measures was the communication and understanding of Canadians who may have made a donation at the front end thinking it was a legitimate cause, and certainly caused a lot of grave concern for them in terms of what it meant. I'm wondering if you've done any review of how it was communicated and whether or not there's any lessons learned from that process.
Yeah, I think that is an excellent question. And because it's so important and given the importance of clear communication, I do want to take this opportunity to reinforce, and I'm now going to read from the RCMP statement of February 21st, that at no time was a list of donors provided to financial institutions. It's important for Canadians to understand that because you're quite right, Senator. Someone could well have made a donation that was perfectly legal to a legal cause. I want to assure them that at no time did the RCMP give their names to financial institutions. I also do want to point out because on June 9th, the Bank of Canada released its annual financial system review. And it actually found that the degree of confidence in Canada's financial institutions and system is at the highest level ever. I am not in any way challenging...
Votre temps est écoulé, Madame la Sénatrice.
Okay.
Your time is up, Madam Senator.
Move to Senator Carignan for 5 minutes.
La Présidente, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Minister, you said that it's the Council of Ministers that decided to declare the Emergencies Act. On what date? I want to be precise. Was it the 13th of February meeting? You are correct. At what time was that meeting held? 8:30 p.m. You know, at 8:30 p.m., the Ambassador Bridge was totally open? Yes. How did you react to the fact that you declared the Emergencies Act, whereas the breach was open? You had that information. You knew that the road could be used. So there are other ways of opening up a breach than adopting an Emergencies Act. At that time, we received information that efforts were being made continuously to block other commercial roads between Canada and the United States, and we continually heard about efforts to block the roads. That is important. And secondly, as you know, the illegal occupation of Ottawa, our national capital, was in effect at the time the decision was made. At the time you took the decision on the 13th of February in the evening, you knew that the Ambassador Bridge had been unblocked and that the authorities, with the resources and tools they had at that time, were able to unblock the road. You knew that. From my point of view, what was important to me was that at that time, there was a constant danger of new blockades. I remember that there was a blockade, one blockade after another. And it was really a danger to have continuous blockades on the border. And I also like to underscore the fact that there was the reality of the fact that our national capital was occupied was also serious. The conversations you had with the American government, I take it that they offered tow trucks. Can you confirm that information? They offered you tow trucks to tow away vehicles? When I spoke directly with the representatives of the American government, the central message was a high level of concern. My question is, did they give you tow trucks and did you accept them? In the conversations they had with me, those conversations concerned trade between Canada and the United States. It was important for senior officials. What about the tow trucks? I discussed possibilities with the United States, possibilities for the United States to help us. But it's difficult for me to underscore to what extent it was important for the Americans. They spoke with me. They told me that for them it was a serious danger and it was important with them to communicate with me. We all agree with you, Madam Freeland. That was resolved before the Emergencies Act. That's the beauty of it. My question has to do with the tow trucks. A minister told us that there were exchanges and that the American government offered us tow trucks. I want to know if that discussion was with you. I've answered that question. The discussions with me targeted the economic impact, and I proposed that it may be possible for the Americans to help us, but the conversations with me focused on the economy. I'll try another question, which was put to you already. You are Minister of Finance. Do you have the figures when it comes to giving us figures about the economic impact of the measures that were taken, the blockade, besides quoting reports? At the time when the decision was made, did you have any figures? I'm talking about the figures of a figure. The question was put to you in English. I'm putting it to you in French. I have many figures in my head because it was clear that there were damages every day. But I also like to say two other things.
And your time is up. And move to Senator Harder.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here. It's also helpful for you to be here in person. I thank you for that. I'm, as you know, a senator from Ontario, resident in Ottawa. So it wouldn't surprise you that I would ask you, why did it take you so long to come to the conclusion that this measure was necessary, given the impact on the border, given the reputational impact, and given the very real impact in business in Ottawa?
Senator Harder, it's a great question. And, you know, I know that this is sort of an adversarial environment, but I'm going to be very candid. It was an agonizing time, I think, for many Canadians, and it was an agonizing time for everyone in government because we had to balance some serious things against each other. We did not invoke the Emergencies Act lightly. That's why it took some time, because we would very much have preferred a situation where it was not necessary. I think every Canadian would prefer a government which would prefer not to have to invoke the Emergencies Act.
Let me ask a follow-up. You and the government come to the view that police action, as it was at the time, was failing in coming to terms with the occupations, either at the border or in Ottawa itself.
I think you have even senators in this group who have greater expertise in policing than I do. But what I will say is, again, speaking now as Minister of Finance, I had Canadian business leaders in touch with me really constantly, in touch with my officials, in touch with my political colleagues. They were gravely concerned. They shared with me the views of their clients and investors in quite vivid terms. And these were not people who hyperventilate. These were people who could really see every day their businesses being eroded and therefore the national economy. And I also took very seriously, Senator Harder, the points of view expressed both in conversation with us by our American partners and also public statements by American politicians who have wanted to have an excuse to impose protectionist measures on Canada. And these blockades and this illegal occupation was the perfect event designed to make it easier for American protectionists to close their market to us.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you about the funding of the occupation of the convoy. What evidence, if any, do you have with respect to cryptocurrencies being involved? And was there, in your view, any worry of illegal cryptocurrencies supporting this, what ultimately became an illegal convoy and illegal occupation?
Okay, so as I said in my opening remarks, the RCMP reported on February 19th that they had shared 170 Bitcoin addresses with virtual currency exchangers. In general, though, let me say two things. The first is my primary concern about the illegal blockade and occupation was the economic impact, what we could actually see with our eyes, frankly. But as it unfolded and as we took action, it did become clear to me that some Canadian legislation had fallen behind the development of the financial sector. And that's why we have actually put forward permanently some new authorities for FinTrack to monitor this now not so new financial space.
Do you have any evidence of money laundering through cryptocurrencies?
I am not going to speak to that, but I think that's a question really for the RCMP.
Do I have time for another question?
You have 15 seconds.
Well, let me simply say thank you for being here.
Thank you. We'll move to Senator White.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for coming in late. I not feeling great today. So thank you very much, Minister, for being here. Yeah, we understand there were no charges laid in relation to the freezing of assets. Also understand the assets were released prior to any thorough investigation. That's according to the law enforcement authorities. What other options to freeze these assets would have been considered, say, in the week or weeks prior to the invocation?
So I have to say, Senator, I can't hear you with perfect clarity, but I think I got most of it. And so just on the freezing of the accounts, I do want to be clear that as of February 24th, all accounts that were frozen pursuant to the order were unfrozen. However, I also want to be clear that I understand that a number of accounts remain frozen pursuant to court orders and proceedings that are unrelated to measures taken under the Emergencies Act. Now, I think, Senator, you may also want me to comment on a point which we did think about, which is what about the possibility of court orders being used to freeze accounts? And that's what I thought you were getting at. And that certainly is a power which exists. The concern was that the additional powers were needed to act more quickly. And I believe that on March 6th, the Assistant Commissioner for the RCMP, Michel Arcand, confirmed that the invocation of the Emergencies Act allowed the RCMP and financial institutions to act much more quickly. He confirmed that each frozen account in other circumstances would have required its own court order, which could take days to be brought forward. And he also confirmed that absent the Emergencies Act, the RCMP would not have had the power to coordinate efforts between themselves and the Ottawa Police Service.
Well, thank you. Sorry, I think you have to mute. There you go. Thank you for that, Minister, because really that's what I'm referring to is February 17th, a Mariva injunction was brought forward by a local lawyer and group of business people that did exactly the same thing that the Emergency Act did. So certainly it should have been considered an option. And the RCMP actually never discussed with us, I don't think, recommending the Emergency Act a week prior when we had them before us. It'll be interesting when we get them back. But since the goal wasn't to seize the assets, it was only to freeze them. I guess my question really was why the government didn't take that step, but you've answered that. Thank you. Can you offer to us what other options were contemplated other than the invocation of the Act for some of the other assets required? For example, aid to civil power by a police agency, in particular the RCMP, who've used aid to civil power probably multiple times every year, typically for equipment, and whether or not that was considered in the absence of the invocation of the Act, and if it was, what made the government decide not to use it?
Senator, when it comes to the powers that the RCMP felt they needed, I think it would be most appropriate to hear directly from the RCMP. I have spoken about court orders and the much more time-consuming process to get a court order for each account versus the approach which the Emergencies Act permitted. In saying that, though, I do want to emphasize one thing, which is I am really aware of the seriousness and the gravity of the authority that the Emergency Act granted when it came to freezing bank accounts. And so I want to pick up on something that you said. The point here was to freeze, to suspend. It was in no way to confiscate. I also want to point out that those accounts were unfrozen as of February 24th. And I further want to point out that the decisions were made by financial institutions themselves based on their reading of the Act and also based on their, upon instruction, upon conversation with the RCMP. These were not political decisions, and in no way were small donors focused on.
Your time is up, Senator White.
Oh, thank you very
You'll
much.
get, second round. Committee members, if you're agreeable, we have time to do 5 minutes this next round, keeping in mind only 2 senators will speak, and that would take us through to 8 o'clock. If that's all agreeable, normally we would be doing 4 at this point, but we have time, so we are good, and we'll lead off with Mr. Brock. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Minister Freeland, you'll agree with me that the...
Madam Chair, on a point of order,
Yes?
I believe that if we don't have, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Madam Chair, I believe if we don't have a 4-minute round now, that prevents one Liberal from asking a round of questions to Minister Freeland, which would render an unfairness. So we would prefer to keep it to the 4 minutes as previously approved in the rules of procedure that we've passed by motion of this committee.
I believe Mr. Nackby will have a chance to ask the question.
There are 3 Liberals on the committee, Madam Chair.
Same number of rounds.
By going instead from 4 minutes to 5 minutes, you will eliminate the possibility of a 3rd round, which eliminates the possibility of a 3rd Liberal from asking questions.
We don't normally have a 3rd round, but if I'm hearing objection, so we'll go 4 minutes. Mr. Brock.
Could I restart my clock, Madam?
Yes, please.
I'm ready now, thank you.
Go ahead.
Minister Freeland, you'll agree with me that the state-owned, taxpayer-funded Canadian Broadcasting Corporation reported on February the 10th, 2022, that the GoFundMe donations to the convoy protest came from donors located outside of Canada. You'd agree with that?
I don't have the report in front of me, and I haven't memorized all CBC reports, but I'm prepared to believe you.
In fact, they stated that the donations came from America, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Australia, New Zealand, and the Netherlands. You'd also accept that as fact?
I don't see the article before me, but you say that's what it says.
They even claimed that the convoy might be Russian funded. Do you recall that?
Again, you're reading from the article.
Yes. On March 21st, 2002, the CBC, without any explanation, without apology, without any clarity, retracted their story regarding the funding of the protest. You were aware of that?
Again, I'm not speaking for the CBC. I'm speaking for the
I'm not asking you to speak for the CBC. I'm asking, were you informed that the CBC retracted the story, the false story, about foreign funding donations to the convoy?
Again, Mr. Brock, I don't believe that the CBC is being interrogated here. I believe it's the government of
Just
Canada.
answer the question, Minister Freeland. Were you aware, yes or no? It's a simple question.
I don't have the article before me, and I'm not here to answer questions about the CBC and
The
its
Deputy
reporting.
Prime Minister, the most senior cabinet minister, is not prepared to accept whether or not the CBC retracted a false story?
I don't speak for the CBC, sir.
You, as the most senior cabinet minister and the Deputy Prime Minister, relied upon that initial story from the CBC and shared your concerns with Canadians regarding terrorism funding and money laundering. Your words, correct?
Let me be very clear. My principal concern when it comes to the illegal occupation and the illegal blockades is the economic harm that was
Let
done
me be
to
very
Canada.
clear, Minister Freeland. Your words several times in the House referred to terrorism funding and money laundering. Are you saying you didn't use those words?
I am speaking here today, and I am talking about the central motivation of our very serious
And
actions.
I'm here to ask you questions, and I expect, unlike question period, I expect a response. So my response is, do you recall using the words terrorism funding and money laundering in the House and reporting outside the House? Yes or no, Minister Freeland?
I believe if we were in a court of law where I think you once worked, that might be called badgering the witness, Mr. Brock.
Chair?
Yeah.
Can we allow the question to be answered?
Thank you. As I said, my core concern as Minister of Finance and my central justification for these very serious measures that we put in place, as was clear in my opening statement.
You're not
as I
answering
have
the
said
question. I'm
throughout,
going to move on.
Is the economic
You're not answering the
impact.
question, and I will move on.
Madam Chair, on a point of order, it's entirely possible that Mr. Brock doesn't like the answers he's hearing, but the witness is entitled to provide an answer. If she could just be provided the opportunity to provide an answer.
Madam Chair, the witness may not like the questions, but she's not entitled to establish her own facts in responding to an answer that is non-responsive and not relevant to the question.
I'd actually just, we'll move back 20 seconds, allow you to ask your last question.
Do you agree with me that the Deputy Director of FinTrack, Mr. McKillop, confirmed at committee that the convoy funding did not come from terrorism funding or money laundering, and the typical person who donated hundreds and thousands of dollars to the convoy came from their own resources and posed no security threat? Do you accept that?
What I accept, Mr. Brock, is that the core threat was to the Canadian economy, to our reputation as a trading partner and investment destination.
Thank you
I
for the
made that clear in
non-response,
my
Minister.
opening remarks, and that is my view.
Thank you for the non-response, Minister. Very helpful.
We'll move to Mr. Nakvi.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you, Minister, for being here today. Minister, as you know, that I represent the riding of Ottawa Centre, which was perhaps has been referred to as ground zero of the occupation right outside this building, but not just Wellington Street, but beyond Wellington Street in all the surrounding neighborhood that is around Parliament Hill, impacting hundreds of businesses, not to mention the Rideau Centre, which is, I'm sure many of us have frequented, which is one of the largest shopping mall in this city, employing thousands of people. And on the eve of reopening, after the mandate of closure by the provincial government, they were forced to shut down for 3 straight weeks. And we saw real impact. In fact, my office fielded many questions from workers, from business owners who were seeking help. One, to end the blockade, the occupation, and two, to give them financial support so they can sustain through that period. Can you speak to, from your analysis, what was specific economic harm you were seeing of that ongoing occupation, and if you had not ended that occupation by way of invoking the Emergencies Act, the harm that would have had on Ottawa's economy? And if you can also talk about what was happening at Windsor and the impact on our economy across Canada and Pacific Crossing, Coots, and other broader crossings as well.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And Mr. Nakvi, I do want to say to you, as the Member of Parliament for Ottawa Centre, I think you and your constituents really were among the hardest hit people by this illegal blockade and occupation. Senator Harder asked me why it was allowed to go on for so long. I know from conversations we've had that many of your constituents asked you that question as well. I think it's a really legitimate question. And I'd like to say to them, through you, that I really regret deeply, profoundly, what they went through. And I hope they will understand that the reason we acted carefully, thoughtfully after the passage of time was that we truly viewed this as a measure of last resort. And these were actions which I firmly believe were the right thing to do. I believed it then. I believe it now in hindsight. But they were actions that needed to be and were taken carefully and thoughtfully. On the specific economic impact to the City of Ottawa, as you know well, the City of Ottawa has presented a report calculating just the direct effect to the city itself, and they put that cost at $37 million. The Retail Council of Canada has calculated that losses just to the Rideau Centre and sales there, the Rideau Centre to which you refer, were $3 million a day. I've already cited Larry Andrade of Deloitte, who calculated that the damages suffered by businesses and employees during the occupation of Ottawa range from $150 million to $207 million. That's just Ottawa. So this is a very, very serious impact. And you yourself know very well the psychological, the personal impact it had on so many people.
Your time is up. Members, we now move to 3 minutes. Mr. Fortin.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Freeland, a preliminary remark. You told Mr. Brock a while ago that a judge will consider what he was doing as badgering. I would say a judge would tell you, with all due respect, enough is enough. Answer the question being asked, because we are wasting our time. It's been about an hour that we've been asking you questions. We asked you what was done before the Emergencies Act was adopted. You did not respond. We asked you why you waited for so long. You did not answer. Senator Carignan asked you if the United States offered you tow trucks. You still did not answer. It's very disappointing, Madam Minister, and I do not know what we will do to implement the mandate that the House gave us. We need information and documents, not an artistic spectacle. So with all due respect, we would want answers to our questions. Maybe let me ask you one last time. What was attempted before the Emergencies Act was passed? You already spoke with many of my colleagues and officials from other departments. I would like your answer, Madam Minister. Could you answer the question or not? Do you know what was done before the Emergencies Act was proclaimed? I was about to answer your questions. You are still dragging your feet. I have a minute left. I know you can drag on for that time, but you know it's very exasperating. Very good. Tell me, if this were to happen again tomorrow morning, if we had blockades on Wellington Street once again, what would be done differently to make sure that the situation doesn't go on forever? Do you have a quick answer for me? We will take the actions that we took against the illegal blockades, and I'm hoping that we will not have that again. Well, we are hoping. Nothing has been planned to change the situation. One of your colleagues told us that if things were to be done again, they will intervene faster to prohibit any blockades of Wellington Street. Why were you not able to stop that last year? Concerning the Ottawa Police Services, you are asking a question about what they did or what they did not do. That is not a decision that had to be taken by the federal government. Madam Freeland, you said you took part in discussions, and you said the Emergencies Act was adopted as a last resort. I took down last resort because you said it was necessary. So if it was necessary and it was a last resort decision, it means you tried something before. In all due respect, you are just saying nonsense. If it was a last resort decision, what other measures did you attempt before? Mr. Fortin, once again, with all due respect, you asked me a specific and detailed question about what the Ottawa Police Force Services did, not necessarily something that had to be done by the Department of Finance. Well, it looks like we're in a competition.
3 minutes.
Thank you. I have to say I find it astounding and perhaps somewhat a little bit embarrassing that the city of Ottawa was able to provide more quantitative impact, economic impact analysis on the occupation than our federal government on the borders across the country, but I digress. On February 17th, you stated that you spoke directly with the heads of major banks and the director of FinTrack. Did the banks or FinTrack express their support or opposition to any of the temporary measures in the order?
On February 17th, the order was in place. And actually, I'm looking at my timeline. I believe that my conversation with the bank CEOs was on
Madam Minister, please.
Yes? No.
I just need an answer. Did they provide any opposition to the directions? Yes or no?
No, but I want to be precise and not to seem to confirm a date which is false.
That's fine.
So,
fair enough. Do you have, you're referencing notes. Can you share the notes from the conversations that you had with them, with the committee?
These are not notes from the conversation. This is a personal timeline of conversations.
Did you have notes from the meetings with the heads of banks and FinTrack? Yes or no?
Let me say something that I think is appropriate for me to share concerning the meetings that I had with the CEOs of the major banks. And that is two things. First of all, before the invocation of the emergency measures, I spoke to Canadian business leaders, including some bank CEOs.
I've already
were
confirmed that. I just want to know,
concerned
do you
about the
have
Canadian
notes?
economy.
Do you have notes, yes or no?
When it comes to the conversations I had with the bank CEOs after the invocation of the emergency measures, at that point, their job was to act in accordance
Chair,
with
listen,
the law we
everybody
had passed.
watching this committee right now can see that you're just refusing to answer a very basic question. It's to the point of almost being contemptible, quite frankly. I'm asking you a basic question. Do you have notes pertaining to those high-level meetings, yes or no? I'm not asking for the content now.
I'm not sure it's very appropriate to call a fellow MP contemptible.
I said it's almost to the point of contemptible. That's my observation.
Just a reminder that when you both talk at once, it's difficult. So keeping in mind the time, Minister, would you please respond?
Yeah, I think that I have spoken about the content of those conversations. It was entirely appropriate for me and my deputy minister to have both individual conversations and group meetings with the CEOs of the main banks. They spoke to us about...
Do you have notes? Do you have notes?
I'm speaking to you now about the content of those conversations.
I'm asking you if you took notes.
Is up.
That is unreal. Madam Speaker, just, you know...
Point of order, Madam Speaker. I don't believe the member has the floor any longer.
Senator White. Senator White.
Thank you very much. Thanks again for being here, Minister.
Point of order. Okay. Point of order, Madam Chair.
Sorry, who?
Point of order.
Yeah, go ahead.
Freeze my time, please.
Freeze the senator's time, please. I disagree with my colleague, Ms. Bendayan, in denying the right of Mr. Green to raise a point of order. I think a point of order can be raised at any point in time.
I would agree with you, but he didn't flag it as a point of order.
Those were his words at the end before he was cut off.
I did not hear that. Mr. Green, did you want to go ahead? I did not hear.
No, at this point, you know what? I just anticipate we're going to have to call the witness back and keep having to have an opportunity to actually get some answers. We're now 42 minutes, we're over an hour into this, and I don't think we've gotten any answers. So
thank you, Mr.
I'll leave
Green.
it's not even a point of order at this point.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator White.
Thank you very much, and my clock will start, I guess. Minister, again, thanks for being here. I was disappointed that you referred to this as an adversarial session because I see it as fact-finding and within the legislation, but I'm just a statement because I don't believe it should be adversarial. There were a couple of areas, though, that concerned me when we were walking through the blockade, and I live in the city of Ottawa, and I'm Senator for here. One was the fact that the mayor was negotiating an agreement with people that we had agreed were committing a criminal act. Did that play into the decision of the federal government to invoke the Emergency Act, the fact that a contract was signed by the mayor and I think Madam Lick in relation to allowing them to fortress around Parliament Hill in exchange for release of other property?
Thank you for your question, Senator. And I don't think it's appropriate for me here tonight to seek to pass judgment on the actions of the appropriate authorities in Ottawa. But what I will say, which is known by us all, is that the authorities had not succeeded at the time that the Emergencies Act was invoked in ending the illegal blockade and occupation. And from my perspective as finance minister, that was a serious problem for Canada, for our economy. And so certainly had they succeeded in ending the occupation, then it may have been possible to behave differently, but they didn't.
But to be fair, I think we are passing judgment. We've heard, I think Senator Harder refused it, a failure of policing, and I think everybody would agree that there was a failure of policing, or else, unless our plan was to be where we were. So I think we are passing judgment. And the truth is, we had a mayor who was negotiating, and I just asked the question because I can tell you I emailed, texted, and called every minister and every member of parliament on the government side who would take that call or read that email saying, I can't believe the mayor has just negotiated with criminals. So did it play into, we need to do something because obviously others are going to ensuring something else is at play that should not be occurring?
What I will say to you, Senator, is I do agree, and I agreed at the time, and I agree with you today, that it is not appropriate to negotiate with people who are doing something illegal. That is not the right way for the government to behave.
One more quick question. May require a longer answer. Yeah, thanks for muting the minister because I get that thing in my ear. Obviously, the province had already invoked their Emergency Act. Obviously, there's something missing provincially in their legislation that did not help or assist the police in actually bringing the blockade to an end. Can you tell us, and I will hope that we'll get the Solicitor General of Ontario in front of us, can you tell us what is missing from their legislation and that forced us to have to invoke the federal legislation instead?
Its time is up. We'll now move to Senator Carignan.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Minister of Public Safety told us that the government invoked the Emergency Act following advice from the Forces of Law and Order. Did you invoke the Emergencies Act following advice from the Forces of Law and Order? I did not personally receive any such advice. Did the Minister of Public Safety tell you that the Forces of Law and Order were proposing to you that you invoke the Emergencies Act? We had lots of conversations, group conversations, but I do not recall any such discussion. So I understand that you do not remember that the Minister of Public Safety might have told you that the Forces of Law and Order asking us to invoke the Emergencies Act. I do not personally recall any such discussion. So personally, do you remember who proposed to you that you invoke the Emergencies Act? For me, I'll be very clear. It is important for me. Well, it was a decision by cabinet, a collective decision. Well, so who had the brilliant idea that that had to be done? Who proposed that first? One moment, please. It was a collective decision. But at that time and today, and I'm talking of the reality for me, I would like to take the personal responsibility for that decision. It was my opinion. It was a correct decision. But are you the one who came up with the idea? We had lots of discussions, but I think it's important for the government. But my question is, are you the one who came up with the idea for the Emergencies Act? Mr. Senator, ultimately, it was a very serious decision and a political decision. And it was a decision taken at a political level. But I don't want to avoid responsibility. I'm ready to say that I was in agreement with the decision when it was taken. And even today, I agree with that decision. We did the right thing. I understood that a long time ago, that you were in agreement. Who came up with the idea? Who made that proposal? We had lots of conversations. It was an emergency situation, and we had lots of conversations about that. Who proposed that bank accounts be frozen? Once again, we had lots of discussions. Mr. Hader and Mr. Fortin also asked me why it took so much time. Lots of discussions were had within the department. We had lots of conversations with other colleagues. Every day, every time, we were wondering.
Time is up. Colleagues, if we could go 1 minute each, if we'd like to do a round and wrap up. And if we're agreeable to that, we'll start with Mr. Motz.
Thank you very much, Chair. Minister, I share the frustration of many of my colleagues around this table. We've danced for 90 minutes and don't have any answers at all, actually. And it appears as if you refer to that binder a lot. Would it, in its entirety, can you present it to the committee? Yes or no?
I make no apology for preparing
well,
carefully for appearances
fine,
like these.
can you present that binder to the committee,
And I
please?
believe in doing my homework. These notes are for my own personal use.
Well, can you present them to committee? Yes or no? Obviously, that's a no. Did you sign the memorandum to Cabinet proposing the declaration of the emergency?
I don't recall precisely who signed it, but I hope I did, and I would be happy to have signed it.
Thank you.
Mr. Motz, Mr. Varani?
Thank you. Minister Freeland, I'm going to go fairly quickly. The freezing of the accounts, that actually occurs by operation of the regulation, not just on February 24th when the invocation ended, but as soon as the illegal activity ceases. So if somebody stops being part of an unlawful blockade, their account should be unfrozen. That's the operation of the regulation. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. And in fact, the RCMP issued a statement, which I brought here so I could refer to it.
I've only got 1 minute, Mr. Freeland, but that's terrific. Thank you. And the restrictions on property were about cutting off the supply chains that were allowing the convoy to continue for week after week. Is that correct?
That's right.
And in fact, just the mere invocation of the regulation and the threat of things such as one's truck insurance being revoked was enough to actually incentivize people to cease their unlawful behavior and leave the blockade. Is that correct?
That is what was reported by law enforcement authorities, certainly.
And when you talked about reputational risk to Canada, I know you and Minister Ng have worked very hard on things such as the Build Back Better bill and the EV tax credits. When we have issues such as supply disruptions on the Ambassador Bridge affecting the auto industry, does that have a direct impact on your ability to stop U.S. protectionist measures such as Build Back Better?
It absolutely does.
Sorry, thank you. Mr. Fontaine, you have 1 minute.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Freeland? It was known in advance that the convoy was headed for the Hill. Maybe there were other things at the Ambassador Bridge and so on, but for the Parliament Hill, we knew in advance, and police officers were worried. At some point, did someone from Cabinet intervene with the police officers to ask that measures be taken to safeguard Parliament? Was that done? Mr. Fortin, as you very well know, it is not normal. 20 seconds left, Madam Minister. It is not all right for the Minister of Finance to go speak with Ottawa Police Services to make recommendations on how. What I understand, Madam Minister, is that nothing was done to prohibit. Okay, what was done to dismantle the blockade besides proclamation of the Emergencies Act?
Green.
Minister of Finance, ultimately the buck stops with you, Madam Minister. You, in your testimony, I think let it slip. You said that the RCMP instructed, and then you said consulted with the banks on which counts to freeze. So whom would have made the decision? Would it have been the RCMP or the banks?
I was clear that there were two routes. Under the order, the banks, using their internal processes, acted so as to be certain that they were complying with the order. The order also permitted the RCMP to communicate directly with the banks and to share with them information, comply with the order.
Were any of the accounts linked to ideologically motivated violent extremist groups?
Again, it was not the job of the Department of Finance to be involved in choosing which accounts should be frozen or not frozen. That's a very important point, and I want to lean in hard on that particular point.
You can lean as much as you want. Did you receive a debrief?
Mr. Green, your time is up. Moving to Senator White.
Thank you very much. I'll be quick with my previous question with no time for a response. The province also invoked their Emergency Act. Can you tell us what was missing from their legislation that required the invocation of the federal legislation? And thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for repeating that question. And you asked me also, Senator, what sort of are the lessons going forward of what should be in provincial legislation? I think that's for the province to figure out, but we did have good, we do have a good working relationship with the province. One of the lessons that I took, which we have acted on already from this, is the need to modernize, bring into the 21st century the authorities of FinTrack, and that is something that is a lesson learned and something we have acted on already.
Thank you for that. And to be fair, though, our job is to make recommendations, I would hope, at the end. So that those recommendations could be for the city, the province. Whether they accept them is a different story. Thank you. I'm good, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator White. We'll move last one to Senator Carignan.
Vous avez dit que vous n'avez pas été informé.
You said you were not informed that law enforcement had given advice that the Emergencies Act should be invoked. You never heard about that. That's what you said a while ago. On the contrary, you took a decision, without the opinion of law enforcement. My work, my job, my duty during discussions amongst colleagues was to share information, to share the concerns we had about the economy. That was the problems I talked about. Well, I know how it works at the cabinet meetings. You took a decision. Ultimately, you took a decision, you vote. You decided to go ahead with the Emergencies Act without knowing the position of the law enforcement officers when you took your decision. It was the job and duty of the Justice Minister to inform us of any possible powers. And there's something else that was important that we did not talk about. The Minister of Justice gave us information about our legal jurisdiction. My question is not for me, it's for the public.
Thank you. Let me express on behalf of the committee our thanks to you, Minister Freeland, for joining us. Colleagues, we'll take a few minutes break as we move to Minister Blair joining us. 5 minutes. We have with us today until 9:30 the Honourable Bill Blair, Minister of Emergency Preparedness. He is joined by officials Jacqueline Bogdan, Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet, Emergency Preparedness and COVID Recovery. Welcome, Minister. You have 5 minutes for opening remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Senator. And first of all, let me begin by expressing my very sincere thanks to this committee for their invitation and the opportunity to speak before you today. Madam Chair, the Emergencies Act invocation on February 14th was the first use of this statute since it was created in law in 1988. The decision to invoke the Emergencies Act was a significant decision for any government to make, and as such, it deserves close examination and scrutiny, and I am grateful for the hard work of this committee to perform that important role on behalf of all Canadians. Madam Chair, responsibility for maintaining public order in Canada, enforcing our existing municipal bylaws, provincial statutes, and the criminal code is the responsibility of the police of jurisdiction. They also have the important responsibility of upholding the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to facilitate lawful, peaceful protest. And in Ontario, these authorities and that responsibility is well defined within the Ontario Police Services Act. And for the use of this committee, and I know, Madam Chair, that this is something you're very familiar with, but I've brought in both official languages a copy of the Ontario Police Services Act, which I hope will be helpful to this committee. Madam Speaker, as the events of the convoy and the protests unfolded, initially with rolling convoys across Canada, then the establishment of an encampment of protesters in the city of Ottawa, the fortification of that encampment with heavy trucks and trailers, and then what we witnessed was targeted blockades, which effectively blocked vital trade corridors and cut off the movement of goods and essential services to our manufacturing sector and the movement of essential goods and services throughout the country. Those blockades and the impact of those border blockades in particular was particularly impactful, and I know previous witnesses have articulated for this committee what some of those impacts are. I have also received correspondence from my ministerial colleagues in Alberta, from the Premier in Manitoba, and from others across the country articulating some of the huge challenges that those blockades represented and the threat to the economic security of those provincial jurisdictions, municipalities across the country. And we've also heard extensive reports from the private sector and manufacturing about the enormous impact those blockades were having. Throughout the course of this event, we observed in many jurisdictions, including right here in Ottawa, that law enforcement was unable to resolve the serious and harmful behaviors that were taking place in a timely and effective way. And for example, the police were unable to remove the heavy trucks that were blocking many of the streets in Ottawa and on municipal and provincial roadways in Ottawa, Windsor, Emerson, Manitoba, Coutts, Alberta, and on the Pacific Highway in British Columbia. In order to determine why the police were having this difficulty, I had conversations and consulted directly with the police leadership and the mayor here in Ottawa, for example. I asked the chief of police in Ottawa if he could advise me why they were unable to tag and tow the vehicles. In my experience, as I spent many years in policing, the tagging and towing of those vehicles seemed like a logical step. But the chief advised me, and I accepted his explanation, that he did not believe that could be done without provoking violence, or it could not be done safely by his bylaw enforcement officers. I then spoke to him about towing the vehicles off the street, and he advised me that notwithstanding that they had a number of service contracts with towing companies in the Ottawa and the National Capital Region, that none of those towing companies were willing to come and remove those vehicles, because in the Chief Slowly's advice was that they were concerned for their safety or for their ongoing business relationship with the trucking industry. But in any event, they would not respond. I had heard similar information, by the way, in my conversations with Minister McIver in Alberta, who identified that they were unable to secure tow trucks to remove the vehicles from the Coutts Highway. And he asked, and we examined whether it was possible, whether or not there was any other towing vehicles that were available to the Canadian government. We examined what was available to the Canadian Armed Forces, for example, and were advised that they did not have appropriate vehicles for that purpose, and that they were unable to assist. But that problem persisted. I also had conversations with the Commissioner of the RCMP as to the challenges the RCMP were facing in the removal of those blockades in the highway in Coutts. And I asked why the Alberta Highway Traffic Act wasn't being utilized to direct traffic off those roadways or to remove the vehicles that were blockading. I was advised by the commissioner that they had information and they were conducting an investigation about the presence of firearms at that particular blockade. And she was quite understandably very concerned about the safety of her officers in engaging in that activity. But ultimately, I was advised that until they were able to subsequently, through investigation, make arrests and seizure of those weapons, that those circumstances did not allow them to use their authorities as existed under municipal, provincial, and federal statutes. And as a consequence, those blockades persisted for a considerable period of time, over 2 weeks in Alberta, over 7 days in Windsor. And throughout those occupations, we were also advised that there was a strong likelihood of further blockades at points of entry like the Blue Water Bridge in Sarnia, the Pacific Highway in Surrey, the Peace Bridge in Fort Erie, that there was strong information being received from our officials advising of the intent of these blockades to return to places that they had previously blocked or to go to new points of entry because it had been a very effective tactic.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off there so we can get to questions. Thank you very much. We'll start with Mr. Motz. This is the 5-minute round. Mr. Motz?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here. Minister, you have just explained to us that you've had extensive contact with law enforcement officials leading up to the invocation of the Emergencies Act. And yet when my colleague, Mr. Fortin, asked the previous minister, Freeland, about speaking with the police, she said that it would be very inappropriate for a cabinet minister to do so. Which is it?
Well, to be very clear, I was meeting on a regular basis. So I'd established a table of consultations through the 3 levels of government, a tripartite table with the City of Ottawa, including the mayor, with our provincial counterparts and my officials. And it was during a meeting with the mayor of Ottawa, talking about how we can assist the City of Ottawa in restoring order and restoring peace and safety to the City of Ottawa.
Okay, fair enough.
I had the conversation with his
So I take it then Minister Freeland was mistaken in her statement. Let me get to another question for you, sir. Your government will undoubtedly assert cabinet conferences, which will, I'm sure you'll do for the documents that we've asked for. But as a president of the Queen's Privy Council, and will you release these conferences of the Queen's Privy Council?
Can you be specific on what confidence you're referring to, sir?
We're talking to the documents that we've asked. This committee, as you know, has asked for all the documents to use to make the decisions on invoking the Emergencies Act. And we've had ministers here before, Lametti, Mendocino, who have made it very clear that there's invoking lawyer-client privilege, as well as cabinet conferences and in the release of those information. And I'm asking you, as the president of that Privy Council, whether you would consider releasing those confidences.
And Mr. Motz, I believe there are processes in place to determine, what documents should be and are appropriately released. There are issues of lawyer-client privileges, for example. Those are areas that are well understood and respected. And I'm aware that the Canada Evidence Act, Section 38, also describes quite clearly how it would be determined how information related to other confidences could be made available. I respect those processes, Mr. Motz, and I respect the law.
So, Minister, when you were the chief of the Toronto Police Service during 2010, you had nearly 20,000 extra police officers at your disposal during that G20 summit. That support was provided to you, was funded and organized by the federal government. Now, here in Ottawa, we had former Police Chief Sully, who testified at committee. He was, and we heard in the media that he was asking the federal government for just 1,800 officers, about a tenth of what was provided to you in Toronto. So why didn't you focus on getting him those resources instead of conjuring up unprecedented use of extraordinary powers in the Emergencies Act?
Be clear, the planning around for the G20 in Toronto was a process that was actually led by the RCMP and that took place over several months and at considerable expense of the federal government at that time. All of those officers that you quoted, all of them, frankly, weren't available for public order in Toronto. But that was a planned event, as opposed to this was a spontaneous disruption of public order in Ottawa. There were, by the way, Mr. Mott, I think you're aware that there were officers.
You do know that this was planned weeks in advance. The Ottawa Police Service and the officials of Ottawa
if I may,
were
Mr.
all
Mott, I think you're
involved in
aware.
planning where they should be and where they should park.
I think you're aware that
of
police
that, right?
services from across Ontario and the RCMP and the OPP all had been providing, from the very outset of this event, police resources to the City of Ottawa to assist in maintaining a public order. But there clearly was a lack of success in actually resolving the issues that were taking place in this. They were unable to move those vehicles, and particularly at the border crossings, although the OPP and other police
Thank you,
services were at
Minister.
Windsor.
It's my question time. I believe, in fact, you did state on the February 13th to the national media that you called the lack of enforcement in the nation's capital inexplicable. Now, you were at the center of discussions for invoking the Emergencies Act, and before the decision to declare this public order emergency, were you briefed that it was being proposed upon the recommendation of law enforcement?
I'm not aware of any recommendation from law enforcement. Quite frankly, this was a decision of government. It's a decision of the government, and although I think quite appropriately we have a responsibility to consult with our officials, to consult with various jurisdictions and others who have authority as to the challenges. And as you'll recall, with the act,
if I'm hearing you correctly, then the law enforcement did not provide advice or recommendations to invoke the act, as Minister Mendocino has been telling the country for the last few months.
I appreciate the opportunity to provide clarity to your observation, if I may, Mr. Motz.
I'm sorry, Mr. Motz's time is up.
And that may come at a later time.
Mr. Naqvi?
Well, the time has come. Why don't you provide that clarity?
Thank you very much. The consultations I was having with law enforcement was with respect to the performance of their duties under the authorities that existed under the municipal bylaws, under provincial statutes, and under the criminal code. And they were clearly having difficulties in affecting the lawful purpose of restoring public order in the City of Ottawa, to protecting the people of Ottawa, to opening up those vital trade corridors that were being blockaded, that the law enforcement was clearly having difficulties in doing that. And I needed to understand why. And so I asked them a number of questions about how they were performing their duties and what impediments they were encountering to do their job. One of the considerations the government has to consider before invoking the Act is to ensure that no other law of Canada can be applied to these circumstances. And so I think it was absolutely essential and appropriate to consult with law enforcement to see why they weren't able to effect this lawful purpose, so that we could, based on the information they provided, make decisions about what would enable them to do the job of restoring order, restoring peace, opening up those trade corridors, and ending what was clearly a national emergency.
That's a very good point you're raising, because I've been curious about this, that when you look at the order and the regulations under the Emergency Act, they're a very precise set of powers. I've used the word surgical almost in scope. How did you go around as government, as cabinet, deciding what powers are needed to put an end to the occupation here in Ottawa and the blockades at border crossings?
Very important question, and we looked very carefully at what was taking place in Ottawa, what had taken place at Windsor, in Coutts, Alberta, and across the country, and we made a determination based on information that we were receiving from our officials and from local law enforcement about the challenges that they were facing. And so you'll notice in those provisions, for example, we had heard from many jurisdictions that they were virtually unable to get the tow trucks they needed to remove those large, heavy trucks that were being used in the blockade. Those vehicles anchored that blockade and made it almost impossible for the police to effect a peaceful resolution of those demonstrations because of the presence of the vehicles, and yet they had no ability to remove the vehicles. And so we added a provision in the legislation that it allowed us to actually exercise some control and commandeer those vehicles from the tow truck companies. I think they were actually grateful that we did that, because it enabled them to do their job without fear of reprisal. And so we took that, we put that provision in there. It's an extraordinary measure. We also, I want to be very, very clear, we were working closely with the province of Ontario, which, as you'll recall a few days earlier, had invoked their own Emergencies Act with a number of very important measures, but they did not address that problem that law enforcement was facing, and so we did it within our act. There was also issues with respect to the need to designate certain spaces for effective action in order for the police to take effective action to protect those spaces. And for example, we have a Bridges and Tunnels Act that protects the Ambassador Bridge, but it didn't apply in these circumstances because the blockade set up on a municipal roadway. And so we needed the ability to exercise a control over that space and to designate that space as a place to be protected under the Emergencies Act that wasn't covered under any other federal or provincial or municipal statute.
Can you speak to us also about the timing of the invocation in terms of not only dealing with the occupation here in Ottawa and the blockades, but was there a preventive element as well? I think you alluded to possible convoys to other border crossings that was also in government's mind when they were invoking these powers.
Yes, sir. First of all, there was a very clear nexus between the demonstrations and the blockades that were happening here in Ottawa, through fundraising and other activities, and frankly, auxiliary and like spokes of the protest here in Ottawa, we were seeing these rolling convoys, and it was popping up at a number of points of entry. Those ports of entry really, in my mind, elevated this to a very significant threat to national security, because that's critical infrastructure. Those transportation corridors, those vital supply lines, the connection to manufacturing in Ontario and other parts of the country, those are critical infrastructure issues in this country. And so we believed it was necessary to end the blockades in Ottawa and to provide better protection to all of those points of entry because of the problems that law enforcement had encountered in keeping them open. We'd had some success. For example, as a result of an RCMP investigation and the arrest of a number of individuals from very serious crimes, the blockade was removed at Coots. But it persisted at Emerson. It persisted at the Pacific Highway. It took 7 days to open the corridor at Windsor, but we were receiving strong intelligence. And frankly, the protesters were being quite vocal that they were going to roll on the Blue Water Bridge at Point Edwards, excuse me. They were going to go to the Peace Bridge. They were threatening, and we believe that those points of critical infrastructure were also at risk. And so there was a preventive measure in order to discourage that, and also to do it in a way which did not necessitate the use of excessive or an overwhelming force, but rather to create strong disincentives to that continued disruption and attacks on critical infrastructure constituting a national emergency.
I'm sorry, Mr. Naqvi's time is up. Thank you. We'll move to Mr. Fortin.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Mr. Blair. Thank you for your testimony. Maybe it's one of the clearest we've had so far, and it's appreciated. But I would like to know, the convoy that came to Ottawa to block Wellington Street had been announced for a while. We agree on that. I read that in January, on the 20th of January, I have an article saying that, well, next Friday, that was a week before, truckers would gather at Saint-Théophile in Chaudière-Appalaches, Saint-Ballon in Austrie, before they meet on Highway 40 in the west of Montreal to head to Ottawa. On that day, they would have colleagues from other provinces. The Ottawa demonstration should culminate around midday. That is what is planned. That was planned. So newspapers were talking about a convoy coming to Ottawa, grouping many people from elsewhere in Canada and maybe from the U.S. And that was 1 week before. You as minister, what happens at the cabinet meeting? Does somebody speak up to say something has to be done to prevent that situation?
Thank you very much for the question. I think it's an important point of clarification of responsibility. First of all, lawful peaceful protests take place every day in this country. And Canadians have, under the Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the right to engage in lawful peaceful protest. In every case, it is the responsibility of the police of jurisdiction in order to police that event, to facilitate that lawful peaceful protest, but also to maintain public order and ensure that the rule of law is maintained and public safety is maintained. And so I was aware that the police of jurisdiction, because it was a public announced event, But I don't believe, Mr. Fortin, that they did have a full appreciation of the nature. This wasn't just a protest. With great respect, it was a blockade. It was an encampment, and it was fortified by these big trucks. And when they came, I think in my conversations with the police, this did not meet their expectations of what was going to transpire. They were prepared to police a protest, but this evolved very quickly into something more than a protest. It became an occupation.
I'm sorry, I don't want to be impolite, but our time is counted. I understand that. But should I take it that really at the cabinet meeting, when you saw that the convoy was headed to Ottawa, to the Hill, you said we are not intervening? It's the Ottawa Police Services that have to deal with that. At no point did you think that something had to be done to prevent that situation?
Like I think all Canadians, I have opinions. But I also am very mindful that my responsibility as a cabinet minister is not to in any way direct the police, certainly the police of jurisdiction, who are governed by provincial statute and not by the federal government.
We are talking about the Parliament Hill, the Parliament of Canada. You have trucks telling you a week before we are headed there and we are going to block Parliament. And you say, well, that's the jurisdiction of the Ottawa Police Services. Is that what you're saying?
And if I may, it is ultimately the responsibility of the police of jurisdiction, but they have every ability to and do frequently. There's strong collaborative relationships I'm aware of, because I've been part of them in the past in a different role, of collaboration between all orders of policing, both municipal, provincial, and federal. They work together and they support each other. But I will tell you, Mr. Fortin, I do not believe it appropriate for the government, a politician, to give direction to the police on how to police this event. We make sure that they have the resources and the authorities that they require, but it's their job to make those decisions.
At that point, if this were to happen again, Mr. Blair, let's say that Friday this week, newspapers announce that in a week, there's going to be a load of trucks coming to block Wellington Street and Parliament. Should I take it that you will say, well, we'll leave it up to the Ontario and Ottawa Police Services. We are not going to intervene. You don't have any plan to prevent such situations from happening? No other measure will be taken? It's going to be like in January or in February?
No, let me be very clear. First of all, I am personally confident that law enforcement and those security officials responsible for Parliament Hill have learned some lessons from what has transpired, and they saw the difficulty that they encountered here, and I have some confidence that they'll respond appropriately. I will also tell you, because I'm aware there's important discussions taking place within Parliament at PROC, for example, and there is other work taking place to look at how we can perhaps deal with the entire Capitol Hill precinct in a more effective way.
Of course, there are approaches and committees sitting on it, but nothing is being provided for by the government. I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Blair.
Mr. Green, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Minister, you're the minister. You're with us today as the Minister for Emergency Preparedness. When did you first become aware of the security threat, and when did preparations officially begin?
First of all, we were aware, Mr. Green, that there was going to be a protest. That protest quickly manifested itself into something much more than a lawful, peaceful protest, and took on elements of criminality and occupation, and the presence of those vehicles. Our officials continued to update us on a very regular basis as to the efforts of law enforcement to properly resolve it.
When did you first become aware that there was a security threat? We have reports publicly that the Integrated Terrorism Response Center briefed on the potential for ideologically motivated extremists. There are emails that have been made available between the National Capital Commission and the Ottawa Police that were back and forth about the nature of this. As the Minister for Emergency Preparedness, when did you first become aware that this could be a security threat, and when did you begin your preparations? I'm just looking for a date, sir.
And I don't have that date in front of me. In the very earliest stages of this protest and then occupation and the work of our officials, I was being regularly briefed. I have the benefit of briefings from our officials, and they were apprising us of their work. They were not seeking operational direction at that time, but I was receiving information about security concerns related.
Would you be willing to
the
share
protest.
those briefings with this committee, sir, for the clarity that we could perhaps contemplate them in camera?
Unfortunately, Mr. Green, those were verbal briefings to me, and I can only provide you with my recollection.
And you don't take notes as a former police officer of decades? You don't take detailed notes on your meetings?
I've always been very careful in carrying any notes or paper with respect to matters of significant confidence, and so I received the benefit of verbal briefings from officials, but I do not take and carry notes from those meetings.
Do your staff take or carry notes, sir?
And again, I don't have that information. I have no notes.
You don't
with
know
respect
if your stats take notes on your behalf at meetings? You don't know that, sir?
What I can tell you is I have no notes from those briefings. I attended those briefings.
I've now asked you if your staff have taken notes.
Well, I'll inquire, but I do not believe that, frankly, my staff have access to some of those confidential briefings of which I am privileged to attend.
Okay, so it wouldn't be in the binder that you have before you, none of those briefings, records of those detailed documents for the being able to refer to your notes to refresh your memory as you would have when you were.
No, unfortunately, Mr. Green, I've gone through this book quite extensively, and none of those notes to which you refer are contained therein.
So in a more official capacity, in the report to the House of Parliament under the Emergency Act consultations, it outlined your participation in several discussions in advance of the declaration. Is it your position that there are no notes pertaining to those discussions under the official consultations of the Emergency Act?
No, it's my position that I did not carry personal notes from any of those consultations or discussions. I can only speak to my own actions and notes that would be in my possession. I can't confirm for you.
You're the minister of your department, sir. You have staff. Respectfully, they are responsible to you. So then I would ask, given that you're not taking personal responsibility, will you take ministerial responsibility to provide this committee with any notes that were taken by anybody at the meetings pertaining to the Emergency Act consultations leading up to the invocation?
Yeah, respectfully, Mr. Green, I take full responsibility for my job as a minister and for my own conduct. And as I've advised you, and I've advised you quite forthrightly, that I attended a number of briefings. I did not personally take notes of those briefings, and I don't have those to share with you. I do have a recollection of those briefings, and which I am prepared as appropriate to share.
You heard my question, correct?
But your question was based on, quite frankly, a premise that was incorrect, and so I feel a need to correct that. If you want to modify your inquiry now,
I'll do it by way of a motion at a further date in a more formal way. Were there any military people involved in the operations pertaining to G20, sir?
To the best of my knowledge, no.
There was no military
I'm assuming you're referring to 2010's G20 that took place in the city of Toronto? Certainly not in any policing function or any function where there was direct contact with the public.
And I'm sure you're aware of aid to civil authority.
Can you hold that till next? Your time is up. Can you hold that to next round?
Sure can.
Thank you. Mr. Fortin, will you take the chair?
Oh, yeah.
Yes. I was wondering about that.
Because okay. Madame Boniface.
Ms. Boniface, you have the floor.
Minister, I wanted to kind of revisit the provincial role. We come from similar backgrounds, and so I was somewhat perplexed at the role of the province and what their Emergency Act provisions provided that weren't available in such a way that the federal act was required. So I'm trying to understand exactly what was the role of the province in their own emergency order.
Yeah, and I have a note in front of me, and I'll read part of it to you if that's all right, Senator. First of all, the as on February 11th, the Premier of Ontario declared a province-wide emergency, as they put it, as a result of interference with transportation infrastructure and other critical infrastructure occurring across the province. In that, they made orders with respect to 400 series highways, airports, hospitals, et cetera, and preventing a number of activities, order prohibiting a number of activities, including traveling to and from critical infrastructure. I think rather importantly, the emergency order did not create any arrest authority. It did not address the issue of the tow trucks. It did not allow us to designate certain spaces for certain activities by the police that were necessary in order to protect those places. It did not pertain to any financial measures to address some of the challenges that our financial tracking officials were facing in dealing with this effectively. And so there were a number of areas that the province felt appropriate to issue their order, and they did. And by the way, it included a number of fines that, to the best of my knowledge, weren't actually utilized. But I believe that there were additional authorities that were required by law enforcement in order to bring about a peaceful resolution of that event and to address what we believe very sincerely was a significant threat to national security and therefore an emergency. And so we brought those measures that were not available in current legislation nor available in the Ontario Emergency Declaration.
Okay, thank you for that. It always still perplexes me in terms of what they chose. Can you tell me in terms of, and I'm going back to a question I think by one of my colleagues around preparation for the G20, and you indicated time frame is much shorter in terms of what we had. Would it be fair to say, as you reflect on it, that the situation here in Ottawa particularly was to a point of overwhelming the capacity of the local and provincial police?
I think that's a fair assessment. I think very clearly it was beyond the capacity of the Ottawa Police Service to do on their own. They reached out very early. I had a number of conversations with law enforcement leaders across the province as well, who were sending resources to help. But I think it did exceed their capacity. And I think there was also a concern. I think the police understood their responsibility to try to resolve this peaceably. And there was a very sincere concern that they expressed to me that their actions could result in a violent response. And they were doing their very best to avoid that violence. And so we also gave consideration to those circumstances that they described in determining that we would be able to enact certain measures that would prove to be a significant disincentive to the continued occupation of Ottawa and those critical points of entry at our borders. And so that was also part of, frankly, my thinking on the measures that we were required to bring forward to how we could help law enforcement bring about a peaceful resolution of this matter.
Appreciate that. And on the integrated command, which was in place for some time, was there any point where you or others in your public safety or where elsewhere in government considered putting the RCMP solely in charge of the operation here in Ottawa?
It certainly wasn't available to us under the current legislative authority governing policing in Ottawa and in Ontario. I think that's very clearly articulated who's actually in charge. And as well, it's not a federal responsibility, if I may respectfully point out, that the authority with respect to providing adequate and effective policing services is, first of all, with the Local Police Services Board, but ultimately it's the responsibility of the Solicitor General for the province of Ontario. And I had a number of conversations with the Solicitor General and with other police leaders about the assistance that was being provided in this jurisdiction and in other places. And for example, we were talking about, the bridge at Windsor. And I know, as you do, the Commissioner of the OPP is a very experienced and capable police leader. And all of the police services that were coming to help, I actually have a great deal of respect and confidence in their leadership. But they were facing challenges that their existing legal authorities, municipal, provincial, and federal, did not allow them to bring about a peaceful resolution. And based on that information, we made decisions as to what needed to be done in order to facilitate that peaceful resolution.
Thank you. I think my time is up.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but it was exactly there. I guess you probably check it by yourself, don't you?
Yes. Senator Carignan, 5 minutes.
Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Minister. Your colleague from Public Safety told us that the Emergencies Act was invoked following advice from law enforcement. Following advice from law enforcement. Were you the witness of any advice from law enforcement asking for the implementation of the Emergencies Act?
Quite frankly, I would have been quite surprised if the police had actually asked for, made a policy recommendation or asked for any legislative authority. My conversations with law enforcement, and I had a number directly with them, was to ask about the challenges that they were facing and how, there were issues of resource, but they were also, they were unable to effect their lawful purpose.
C'est toujours l'histoire des remorqueuses.
Still about the tow trucks. They were not able to remove the tow away the trucks.
Good example. I asked the chief here, but I also asked the RCMP why they weren't, tagging and towing those vehicles. In my experience, that's a very common thing for the police to do. And they would do it in other jurisdictions. But the chief of Ottawa expressed to me what I believe to be sincere concern that to do so would have been provocative, potentially leading to violence. And he also expressed very sincere concern that it would be unsafe for his officers to enforce those laws.
How did the Act allow the trucks to be removed from Ottawa? What additional power was contained in the Order or Emergencies Act that allowed that those trucks could be removed? Because pursuant to the current law, without the Emergencies Act, the police could compel a tow truck owner to do something. If not, they could go to court using the criminal code. The criminal code provides that could be compelled according to the criminal code. So what did the Emergencies Act change?
Police services in every jurisdiction across the country have contracts with tow truck companies. They don't own the tow trucks themselves in the vast majority of jurisdictions. They have contracts. And part of those contracts is those companies have the types of vehicles that are required to remove big tractor trailers. And unfortunately, in every jurisdiction, I have a letter here which I'll share. I brought copies of it that I received, for example, from my ministerial counterpart in Alberta, Mr. Minister McIver, in which he said, and I think very importantly, actually I'll be able to read it to you a little bit here. He said that despite our best efforts to resolve this ongoing issue, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police have exhausted all local and regional options to alleviate the week-long service disruptions at this important international border. And so they were asking for help.
OK. Donc, si vous n'êtes pas au courant.
So, if you are not aware that law enforcement gave advice that the Emergencies Act should be used, who advised the government to use the Emergencies Act?
Sir, the police did not advise me that the Emergencies Act should be used. The police were very clear about the challenges they face. Good, sir. There were a number of discussions among colleagues. I will tell you, based on the conversations that I'd had with the challenges that learned about the challenges that law enforcement was having, I did not sort of.
Are you the one who came up with the idea that the Emergencies Act be invoked? Was it your idea?
Quite frankly, and I will acknowledge to you, I wasn't suggesting the Emergency Act be invoked. I believed that it was necessary for us to examine all of the legal options that were available to us to determine whether or not the emergency that existed met the legal threshold. I thought that was an important thing to examine and to look at. Were there authorities that currently were not available in any existing law in Canada to assist the police, and were those measures available to us? And it was also an important consideration, would they be effective in helping to bring about a peaceful resolution of this incident?
Et qui vous a suggéré?
Who suggested that bank accounts should be seized?
I have no recollection of that recommendation. And can I make just, it's an issue of semantics, but there was no recommendation that there should be a seizure. Froze is it's a very different, it's important clarification, if I may, sir, because the ability to freeze an account is
Minister, if I freeze your account during 3 days, perhaps you will say that it's a seizure.
Well, with great respect, sir, seizure, I think, is well articulated in both criminal and civil law in Canada with respect to forfeiture. That would account for a seizure.
I think
freezing those assets.
Not agree with you, I think.
Well, but respectfully, in law, There's a very significant difference between freezing an asset and seizing an asset, and there are very different legal procedures. There are very important and complicated legal processes.
But I can guarantee you that seizure, when you quand vous gelez un compte de...
When you freeze a bank account, the Supreme Court considers that a seizure.
Thank you. Senator Harder.
Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here. Minister, I just want to, by way of comment, thank you for your candor, not only tonight, but for throughout this event. I noted, for example, when early in the process of observing the occupation, you said the police need to do their job. And tonight you acknowledged that the law enforcement was unable to bring a peaceful resolution to this. That observation we enjoyed here in Ottawa for several days. Why did it take so long for the government to form a view that action had to be taken?
Well, first of all, we believed action had to be taken, but we also believed it was the responsibility of the police of jurisdiction. And frankly, I have, as you can imagine, great respect for the institution of policing and that the delineation of their responsibilities in Canadian law. And so we gave every opportunity and offered every support in resource to try to assist the police in bringing about that effective resolution. But they made it very clear that they were not successful and could not be successful without help. And they didn't tell us how to deliver that help, but they told us the problems that they were having.
When Ontario government developed their order, their emergency order, did they consult with you as to what that order should include?
I was aware that they were considering it, but they didn't ask me personally, and so I was not personally consulted on that.
What was included or excluded was, in a sense, their own decision.
Well, of course, it is their decision and their authority, but I was not consulted on what they were put in their act.
There's an interesting simultaneous set of circumstances with the order being imposed and a change of police leadership in the police of jurisdiction. How do you assess the role of the Emergency Act and the change of police leadership in leading to what was a very successful police action?
Mr. Senator Harder, that's a difficult question. I think that the action that we took in invoking the Emergency Act and the measures that were introduced, I think they were necessary. Frankly, I think the principle of strict necessity is an important one. And I believe very clearly that a state of emergency existed, that there was a very real threat to our national security and particularly a critical infrastructure resulted in the actions of these protests and occupations. I also believe that by providing those new authorities, it did a number of things. I think it provided the police with the tools and resolution of challenges that they hadn't up until that point been able to overcome. But I also think it sent a very clear message to those who were engaged in that unlawful activity that the game was over and that there were going to be consequences for their continued action. And we saw that. We witnessed that. A lot of them just packed up and left. And those who didn't, the police still had a job to do, and they went out and did it. And by the way, I'd take the opportunity to commend them for the very professional way in which they did it.
I agree with that. One last quick question. I just want to confirm with you, both with your police experience and in your ministerial role, that in your view it would be inappropriate for the police to ask the government to invoke the act. It is not for them to ask government what emergency measures ought to be invoked by the government.
No, I do not believe that wouldn't have been an appropriate thing for law enforcement to ask, and they did not ask. But what they did is honestly answer our questions about the challenges that they were facing, and that information did inform ultimately our decision, but it wasn't based on their request.
Exactly. Thank you.
Senator Harder, we'll move to Senator White.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thanks to the Minister for being here today. A couple of quick questions. We talked about the invocation of the Provincial Act, Emergencies Act, and the fact that I think maybe your words summarizing had little or no impact. Did you have any discussions with them about going back to the well and adding some tools that you felt were missing from their original invocation?
No, Senator, I did not have that conversation with the province.
Do you believe that they should have had the discussion with, I mean, obviously it didn't work. Proportionality is an important part of the Emergencies Act, whether it's provincial or federal. Obviously, their tools weren't proportional to the challenge if they weren't actually impacting on the challenge. Do you believe that they should have given more consideration to the fact that it had little or no impact on the actual removal of the blockades?
Well, I believe that in good faith, they acted in good faith, and they took the steps necessary and invoked the authorities that they believed were within their authority to enact under provincial legislation. But I also believe that there were a number of things that perhaps weren't available to the province that became our responsibility. And I would point out, and I know you're already aware, Senator, as is this committee, that there were consultations with the premiers across the country, including with the Premier of Ontario, before we invoked our federal legislation and the Emergency Act. And so I think it was really a determination of a proportional and appropriate use of various levels of government's authorities in order to bring about. I think we've shared we had a shared commitment to bringing about a peaceful resolution, and we were both prepared to take whatever actions would enable that to happen.
Thank you for that. In discussions we've had with the RCMP, we were told that there was a plan in place to remove the convoy. And in fact, we were told by the Deputy Commissioner that they had the belief that the plan would succeed in removing the convoy blockade, or fortressing, as I've called it, in the downtown core. Did you have an opportunity to review that plan prior to the invocation of the Act?
I did not engage in myself in the operational responses of the police. I think I actually have a great deal of respect for the operational integrity and independence of the police to make the determination. They are governed by the rule of law, by their Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and my expectation is that their response would be effective and proportional. But what we did witness is that for a number of weeks, the law enforcement response, not just here in Ottawa, but particularly here in Ottawa, but not just here in Ottawa, had not been able to resolve those blockades of critical infrastructure in this country in a timely way. And even, the blockades in Windsor, for example, went on for 7 days. And ultimately, the police were successful in removing that blockade, but at an enormous cost to not just the economy of Canada, but to people, like people that were idled, workers that were idled and when their plants were cut. They lost their hours. They lost their ability to support and feed their families. There was a very real impact by those blockades for those Canadians.
But if I may, Minister, prior to invoking the Emergency Act, wouldn't we have wanted to see what their plan was going forward? Obviously, their plan for the first number of weeks didn't work, but we were told by the RCMP, which is a federal agency, that they actually had a plan that they felt was going to work just days prior to the invocation. Do you know if the Minister of Public Safety, to whom there's a more direct link with the RCMP, had reviewed that plan to see whether or not, in other words, did they believe that if this plan will be unsuccessful, we need to do something else? So do you know if anyone in the government saw that plan?
I can tell you, I can only speak for myself, Senator, and what I can tell you is I did not see any evidence of a plan that would effectively end these illegal blockades and the enormous impact it was having on this community and Canadians right across the country. I did not see evidence of a plan to effectively deal with that. One of the most important things, and I keep on coming back to it, and people say, well, the tow trucks, getting the tow trucks there to remove those vehicles is a trivial matter, but it was not. And in fact, those trucks, you referred to it as a fortress in this community, and somewhat a fortified encampment that was taking place at our borders. But the inability of law enforcement to have those trucks removed from those locations very significantly impeded their ability to end those occupations and to remove that threat. And so it was something that we felt that we needed to do. There were a number of other measures that similarly were necessary to designate certain spaces for law enforcement action, for example, to deal with particular situations where people were bringing children into those areas, which made law enforcement's job really, really difficult and dangerous.
If I may, because the chair is going to stop me, did you express concerns with the mayor of Ottawa, who was negotiating with people who are involved in criminal activity, to allow them to take certain land and further fortress it to give up other land?
First of all, I did not have any conversations with the mayor about his negotiation. However, I would make the observation that as a result of when I saw the document of what had been agreed to, and that they had allowed, in order to get the blockades and the protest activity out of certain areas, to limit it only to Wellington Street and the John A. Parkway, that struck me as a bit of a challenge for law enforcement in their response, because that could be interpreted as the mayor giving them permission to be in that place.
Minister, I'm afraid I have to cut you off. I apologize.
Thank you very much, Madam
quick
Chair.
point of
Thank
order.
you, Minister.
Yes.
I'm looking at the Zoom screen, and it appears that perhaps the clerk and the French interpreter may still have their mics on, and that might be causing us some of the feedback. There's no mute icon on their screens unless there's no mic attached to it.
No mic.
But
There's no mic attached, I understand.
what about with the French interpreter? It doesn't appear that there's a mute. There's some feedback coming. I've done now 2.5 years of these Zooms, and I've never had this type of cross feedback.
Well, continue, Mr. Green, and we'll look into it while that's taking place. Perhaps we can, we've now go to next round, and I'm looking for direction from the committee. We can go 4 minutes for members, some members, and 3 minutes for others, but we do have enough time. Instead of doing the 1 minute round at the end, we could go for 5 minutes. If members want to share their time, they can do so with others. Spoke to some, but I'm just making sure everybody would be agreeable to that. Okay.
Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I'd prefer to stick to the rules that we've established for this committee, which is the next round should be a 4 minute round.
Okay. Then that is the motion on the floor, so it's my understanding we have to conform to the motion. So we'll go, Mr. Brock, you have 4 minutes.
Good evening, Minister Blair. I want to sincerely thank you for attending today. And as an observation in line with Senator Harder, I really want to sincerely thank you for your candor and your willingness to respond appropriately to every question that has been put to you. You have been non-evasive, and you have been giving us substantive answers. The whole process is to get to the truth, to determine whether or not there was a legal justification for the invocation of the act. Unlike the Deputy Prime Minister, who wasted 90 minutes of precious committee time, I sincerely thank you. I wish to start off, however, describing my bewilderment and astonishment that someone with your experience in government, someone with your experience in policing for several decades, someone who has participated in the invocation of emergency powers that have never been used in the history of this country, would not take notes. I find that absolutely incredible. I want to ask you very, very clearly, in any discussion with Cabinet or your officials in your department, are you telling this committee you did not keep any notes, no note-taking by you, regardless of the number of meetings?
And Mr. Brock, that's in fact true.
Thank you.
I do not keep notes.
I'm going to present to you a series of questions that, in my view, has seriously undermined the confidence of Canadians in this government as to the rationale behind the invocation of the Act. I'm going to ask you whether you agree or disagree. Minister Mendocino has been under fire as of late in the House and in the press because he has made it abundantly clear that it was on the advice of nonpartisan law enforcement that the invocation of the Act was established. We now know that neither the RCMP or the Ottawa Police asked the government to invoke the Act, despite those claims. Do you agree or disagree?
And because I do want to be very candid and forthright with this committee. The police did not ask me
Thank you.
But if I may?
Yep.
But they did.
No, you
they
answered
did
my
answer
question. I have limited time, sir, with all due respect. I have
to be
limited
very
time.
clear, it's an important question you've asked, sir. They provided me with information that I acted upon and that I believe to be true.
Thank
that
you.
informed my subsequent decision
Thank you,
and
Minister.
support for the Emergencies Act.
Thank you, Minister. Minister Mendocino also falsely claimed, misled Canadians in believing that the Freedom Convoy protesters set fire or attempted to set fire to an Ottawa apartment after locking residents inside, which, according to Ottawa police, was not true. You accept that?
In part. First
All
of
right.
all, I'm
Thank
aware
you.
that was not related to the protest.
Thank you.
I don't ascribe any other motive to anyone else.
Thank you. Despite reports of illegal guns in the cabs of some truckers protesting in Ottawa, no gun charges have been laid to date. Despite claims by Minister Mendocino that women were threatened with sexual assault by protesters, no sexual assault charges have been laid to date. You accept that?
If I may provide a clarification, I was advised by the RCMP that in their investigation of part of the blockades that were taking place in Alberta, that they did have reliable information and intelligence that there were firearms present. They subsequently conducted an investigation and they've laid charges. That matter is now before the court, and I'm not going to comment because it's inappropriate to do so. But in that case, there were firearms present and they represented a significant threat to public safety and to the police
In
conducting an
Alberta,
investigation.
there were no guns found in Ottawa.
Again, that's information better provided to you by the police. I don't have all the particulars of their investigations, and I'm not going to comment. It's not appropriate to.
Thank you, Mr. Brock.
Point of order, Chair. This minister just inferred again that the guns found in Coots were somehow protesters, and that is not true. The RCMP have made it very, very clear that it's
Point
not
of order,
true.
Madam Chair. I don't believe
I'm
there
not
is
done.
debate.
I am not done.
This is not a point of order.
I'm not done. You can have your point.
What is the point of order? Is it relevance? Because otherwise,
Well, let
I'm
him
not done.
finish before you assess that.
And can I be the chair, please, Mr. Mott?
It's not a debate.
Well, out of
I'm trying to
respect,
correct
allow him
a
to
false
finish the
statement.
point of
Mr.
order.
Brock, we will allow Mr. Motts to speak.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's important that this committee hear accurate information, that Canadians do want accountability and transparency, but to suggest, even remotely, to infer that the firearms in Coots were somehow related to the protesters, we all know
Madam
is
Chair,
false. And
the witness's
RCMP
testimony
has made
stands,
it clear,
and this member
the
is not
RCMP has
raising a
made-
point of order, Madam Chair.
The RCMP has made it clear that that is a criminal organization that had no ties to the protesters. So don't suggest anything otherwise.
We leave it at that. Ms. Van Dyne, please go ahead.
I would like a ruling on the point of order, Madam Chair.
It's not a
Madam
point of
Chair, I'd
order.
like to
Go
speak to
ahead.
the same point of order.
I just indicated it's not a point of order and asked Ms. Van Dyne to go ahead.
We'd ask that speech making then be struck from the record because you can't bootstrap your time by raising non-existent points of order to voice your disagreement with the witness's testimony. It's inappropriate, and I think Mr. Motts is beyond that.
When a statement is false, you have to correct it. Or else, what are we doing in this House?
Can we go ahead, Ms. Van Dyne?
I guess we're going to agree to disagree on what's a false statement, Mr. Motts, but thanks for raising a non-point of order.
Madam Chair, if it is open then to question the legitimacy of statements made, then earlier Mr. Motts impugned a statement to Minister Freeland, which was entirely incorrect. He mischaracterized her testimony. So if we are free to make those interventions.
I would ask us to proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Ms. Van Dyne.
Minister Blair, thank you very much for your testimony today, and I would ask for your views on a letter dated February 5th from the government of Alberta. I recall seeing this letter, which was made public, and actually reading it into the record of the House. It says in part, and I quote, that they've exhausted all local and regional options to alleviate the week-long service disruptions, end quote, and they are asking the federal government for urgent assistance. Do you recall that letter, Minister?
I do recall the letter, and for the help of this committee, I've brought copies for all of the members if you'd like me to table it.
I would. I was not aware. Please do so. Do you have any other such letters from other provinces or communications that, if you have anything else that you'd like to table with the committee, I would certainly be open to that.
I have a letter that I think is relevant as well, and it's dated on February 11th, and it was written to the Prime Minister, but I have a copy of it because it was also copied to me, and it's from the Premier of Manitoba, in which she talks about the critical trade corridor, the orderly and constant movement of traffic is indispensable link in the supply chain relied upon by all Manitobans.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you for providing us with those copies. What were you hearing from provinces and municipalities prior to the invocation of the Emergencies Act? And I'm looking specifically to understand if what was being requested would have been possible to provide from the federal level without invoking the Emergencies Act. Were they asking for things that, in your opinion, we needed to provide through the Emergencies Act and the regulations and powers exercised under it?
Thank you. If I may, one of the things that the minister from Alberta was asking for was that he was trying to get access to tow trucks. They couldn't get them from the tow companies in Alberta. They just wouldn't come for a number of reasons that he articulated to me. But he was trying to get access to tow trucks. He asked that the Canadian Armed Forces had appropriate vehicles that were fit for purpose of removing and towing up to 70 vehicles off the Coots Highway. So we inquired. And that's one of my responsibilities because I responded to requests for assistance. We inquired of the Canadian Armed Forces, and they advised they did not have appropriate vehicles for that purpose. But it was Minister McIver, quite respectfully, was not the only one facing this enormous difficulty of getting those vehicles removed. They were being used to anchor those protests, and it really was a significant challenge for law enforcement, but it was illustrative of some of the challenges that we were being asked of. And we responded through one of the measures of the Emergency Act by making it available to basically to commandeer those vehicles and to make sure that they were available for the purpose that they were required for.
And I understand that you're quite familiar with the swearing in of RCMP officers. Can you tell us a little bit about, how the invocation of the Emergencies Act assisted us in providing personnel in support?
Actually, I've been involved in this a number of times. I used to, as a police officer, used to come up to Ottawa and help with big protests up here too. But we've always faced a challenge. Police officers coming from anywhere else across the country, and particularly RCMP officers, they are not sworn in as constables for the province of Ontario and therefore unable to enforce certain laws and provisions in this jurisdiction. And so we in order to facilitate the movement of police officers from across Canada to come to Ottawa to help with these measures, there's a section within the Emergencies Act that allowed those RCMP officers to act as police officers here in the province of Ontario or anywhere else in the country for which they required that authority.
Your testimony, you mentioned threats of blockades reappearing. I understand that police stated publicly that they intercepted a convoy of individuals headed from Ottawa to re-blockade the Ambassador Bridge. Were you aware of that?
And this was information that we were receiving from intelligence sources, that there was a very serious concern among law enforcement.
Minister, I'm sorry, Mr. Van Dyne's questioning is finished, so I apologize. Thank you. And we'll move to 3 minutes now. Mr. Fortin.
Okay. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Minister, I see letters that you've just distributed. I have dated 5th of February, one from the Premier of Manitoba and the other from the Premier of Alberta, who apparently are overwhelmed by the situation. But when you proclaimed the Emergencies Act, in the annex to the proclamation, there was the consultation of premiers regarding the Emergencies Act. Did you read that consultation at that time? And for Alberta, it said that the Premier of Alberta declared on Twitter that the government of Alberta was opposed to the invocation of the Emergencies Act. He opposed it on the 14th of February. We are talking about Manitoba. The Premier of Manitoba declared that the situation varied depending on the province and territory and said that the declaration she was not convinced at the time that the Emergencies Act should be applied in Manitoba, given the extensive scope of the Act. She was of the opinion that it was not constructive to implement the Act in Manitoba. On the 14th of February, the two premiers from Manitoba and Alberta say, no, we don't need the Emergencies Act. But it's invoked. Don't you find that surprising?
Well, frankly, no, Mr. Fortin. I'm not surprised by it. What I can tell you is that there is a requirement under the Emergencies Act that consultation take place with the ministers. That consultation did take place.
Mais vous n'avez pas suivi les recommandations.
But you did not follow the recommendations clearly. I have a minute left. I'm sorry, Mr. Blair. I'm very impolite. I'm sorry, but we don't have enough time. We saw that when the police officers unblocked Wellington Street here in Ottawa, there was nothing magical. There was no helicopters, the army, no squads, nothing like that. Police officers came very calmly, very slowly, and they evacuated the demonstrators. And there were tow trucks that moved the trucks. There's nothing there that made me think, wow, the Emergencies Act did something wonderful. It was a simple police operation, something that you must have done during the G20 events or during other events. Could you tell me how this evacuation of Wellington Street was derived from the implementation of the Emergencies Act?
I think there were some very important provisions that were made available to the police that supported their resolution of that event. And for example, they were able to get tow trucks for the first time they weren't previously.
I'm sorry, Mr. Minister. I don't want to know what was possible. What was done in reality? Were emergency measures used to unblock Wellington Street? That did not seem to be the case when we watched TV.
With the time, I apologize. Mr. Green, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Minister, I've talked in the past about the juxtaposition between the different styles of policing. I've referenced what's gone on in the Wet'suwet'en with lethal overwatch. Today, we've talked about G20. In your opinion, how could you care to comment on the juxtaposition? How do you explain to Canadians that the folks who were protesting G20 were met with riot gears, kettling, mass suppressions of their charter rights, and the folks that were in Ottawa here essentially had the red carpet laid out? They were provided with provisions for off-site accommodations, and there was oftentimes actually the appearance of almost a collaboration between the police and the occupiers. Can you comment on the juxtaposition of those two states of policing in Canada?
I think it's a very important question, and thank you, Mr. Green. I think it's important for us to understand the principle of proportionality in the response of the police. And as I've said, it is the responsibility of the police to uphold our charter, to facilitate lawful, peaceful protest. And when that protest becomes unlawful, then they have also a responsibility to uphold the law, but to do it in a way which uses minimal force.
So I'll stop you there. Okay, thank you for that. We'll
except your question does require a more fulsome answer. You can stop me.
Then you can provide it. You could provide it to us in writing if you'd like to. At the end, I have 2 minutes left. Chief Slawley said that there may not be a police solution to the demonstration, and then since stated that our institutions and police services were unprepared for the convoy. Do you agree with that assessment by the former chief of police?
I accept Chief Slawley's assessment that he was unprepared for what took place in Ottawa.
And as the minister responsible for emergency preparedness, what responsibility do you take for the unpreparedness of a mass movement protest at the nation's capital?
Yeah, thank you. And I would point out that Chief Slawley is accountable to his police services board and through the Ontario Police Services Act. Now,
as the minister responsible for emergency preparedness, ostensibly you would have protocols in place for blockades on major ports of entry and for the nation's capital. What responsibility do you take for the lack of preparedness leading to the events occurred during the occupation?
Actually, what we saw is that they didn't set up on federal land. They went to municipal land, and I think they were exploiting.
You wouldn't have protocols for the country? As the minister responsible for emergency preparedness under anti-terrorism protocols or all the other things that came after Bill C-51, are you saying that within your mandate letters, it is not your responsibility to be prepared to have a national plan for a state of emergency?
And there is, but not. This was not a terrorist event. To be very clear, Mr. Green, this was not a terrorist event. This was an illegal blockade. It was a criminal offense. In many of those places, it is the responsibility of the police of jurisdiction, and we support them.
So it didn't meet the threshold for your responsibility? It wouldn't meet the threshold for it being under your responsibility as an emergency? Is that what you're stating today on the record?
It evolved into a situation that constituted an emergency. It wasn't an emergency in its initial days. It was an enormously challenging and difficult public order problem for the police of jurisdiction here in Ottawa. As it manifested itself at borders, it became a more significant. It elevated to the level of, but it elevated at our borders to an issue of a national security threat and a threat against critical infrastructure.
Well, you acknowledge that you
Mr.
weren't
Green,
prepared,
your time
sir.
is up. Senator White. Senator White, you're on mute.
Twice and now it works. Thank you. Sorry about that. I'm going to jump right into it because you made a statement that it allowed for the swearing in of, or the use of RCMP officers and other officers from other services. But there is another alternative. We can't swear them in, as I'm sure you've been involved in the swearing in of RCMP officers for G8 events, G20 events, and here on every Canada Day, I think we swear in 700 or 800 RCMP officers so they can perform the same duties as a municipal police officer, correct?
Senator, that was the challenge. It takes time, and we were trying to facilitate a quick response to the needs of the City of Ottawa, the jurisdiction.
No, that's perfect. Thanks for that. I just didn't want to leave it out there, the only one option. Can you tell us, in your 37 years of policing, probably, give or take a couple, have you ever seen an event like this? And look, you're policed in Toronto, the big city in the country. Have you ever seen anything like this?
Yeah, I've actually policed an awful lot of protests in my life, Vern, and I was a public order commander in Canada, in Toronto for about 9 years. Of course, I was the police chief there for 10. I also helped in other jurisdictions in public order events. I think there was some very unique challenges in the circumstances that arose here. I've never seen a situation where trucks were used in this way to essentially create a blockade, a fortress, in that made the movement of moving people around in a protest is a relatively straightforward activity. It's difficult at times, but it's doable. But I think those trucks made it particularly challenging. And then the targeted actions that were taking place at our border clearly intended to cause maximum harm to Canadians and Canadian economy. It represented a significant challenge because of the jurisdictions that were overlapping and conflicting.
Thanks for that. And then quickly, we had legislation come from the other place into the Senate in regards to protests in relation to health officials, nurses, hospitals. And there was consideration given in our committee in the legal committee about adding in there, making it illegal using vehicles to participate in those protests. Is it time for us to pass legislation in this country to make it illegal to use vehicles in those protests?
I think it's a very important conversation that we should have here in Parliament. I think there's a number of considerations that need to be fulsomely examined. But certainly the use of vehicles was complicated in these circumstances. And I think we also have to give consideration to taking the steps that are necessary, and this is part of my responsibility, to ensure that critical infrastructure, including manufacture in those essential trade corridors, have the necessary authorities that can be used to protect them.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm finished. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Carignan.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Minister, Senator White a while ago talked about the RCMP plan for removing the blockades. On the 12th of February, the Ottawa Police also came up with an opinion saying that all available staff were deployed. They have a plan to put an end to the illegal occupation, and they were waiting for necessary reinforcements. On the 12th of February, the Ottawa Police said they had a plan. Were you informed of that plan?
From open sources, I of course read the media and watch the TV like everyone else, but I had not seen the particulars of a plan. And frankly, the situation that existed here in Ottawa and in other places in Canada required more than just more people. It required the ability to deal with some very difficult issues that they were confronted. I'm sorry?
Avec un plan.
With a plan.
Well, of course.
Okay. Mais vous avez pas.
But you did not talk to the Ottawa Police to find out what their plan was.
And again, Senator, respectfully, that is an operational activity of the police of jurisdiction, and it's not appropriate for me to engage in any.
Est-ce que vous savez que la police d'Ottawa...
Do you know that the Ottawa Police Services removed vehicles on the 10th of February?
There was some, like very small vehicles, cars.
Non, des camions.
No, trucks.
That were removed.
Des gros camions, là.
Huge trucks.
And removed how, sir? Like, could you clarify that?
La police d'Ottawa...
The Ottawa Police towed away trucks on the 10th of February.
OK. Donc, vous avez...
So you do not talk to the Ottawa Police Services to find out what their plan was. On the 12th of February, they tell us that they have a plan. On the 10th of February, they were able to tow trucks. On the 14th of February, the blockade at the Ambassador Bridge was lifted. Vehicles were towed. The bridge was open. On the 13th of February at 8:30, you had a cabinet meeting. And you concluded that there was no other means besides adopting the Emergencies Act.
The blockade, for example, at Ambassador Bridge took 7 days to clear. And there was strong indications and evidence that it was the intention of the blockaders to return to that bridge and other bridges. And so, we weren't going to play whack-a-mole with this, because if it was going to take 7 days to clear, the hourly impact, economic and personal, for Canadians of those blockades was enormous and significant. And we wanted to make sure that we ended that threat.
Donc, vous n'aviez pas connaissance du plan, vous n'avez pas été avisé par les services.
You were not aware of the plan, you were not informed by the police officers, and you decided that an Emergencies Act was necessary.
Senator, to be very clear, I was aware of the work that the police were doing, but I'm not briefed on their plan, nor should I be.
Mais qui l'a été? On a l'impression que c'est...
Who was then? We have the impression that no one speaks to one another in that cabinet meeting. No one was informed by the police services that they had a plan and that they could remove the vehicles. One would think that the cabinet was ignorant.
Your characterization is incorrect. Your characterization is incorrect. The police did not at any time tell me that they were prepared to resolve this effectively,
Minister,
and that they
I'm
have the
sorry.
tools to do so.
I have to cut you off there. We have 6 speakers. We have 1 minute each. We'll start with Mr. Motz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Minister, the protest in Coutts, Alberta was resolved the day before the Emergencies Act was invoked, and police in Coutts addressed the situations there without measures provided in the Emergencies Act. Further, we know that the blockade at the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor was also cleared by law enforcement prior to the invoking of the Emergencies Act. Given what we know already, was invoking the Emergencies Act truly justifiable, given the threshold that has to be met that it cannot be used? It can only be used if no other law in Canada will suffice.
Yeah, thanks for the question. The resolution in Coutts coincided with the culmination of a police investigation involving the seizure of firearms and a number of people involved in a very serious series of events that resulted in charges now before the court. We also had indicated that we were taking action that I think probably rational people took advice of and left that jurisdiction. But Mr. Motz, to be clear, the dismantling of the blockade in Coutts did not end the threat in Alberta or anywhere else in Canada. And that these blockaders had made it very clear of their intention to continue to disrupt our border.
Thank you. I'm going to have to cut you off there. Apologize again. Mr. Varani, you have.
Yep. Thank you, Minister. I have 4 really quick questions. With respect to something that Mr. Fortin raised, isn't it correct that with the invocation of the Emergencies Act, as you indicated, the mere fact of having invoked these powers was incentive for some people to leave the illegal blockade, and thus that reduced the size of and the number of blockaders, which then made eventual clearing easier because there was less people to simply clear out? Is
I believe
fair?
that's very obviously true. Yes, sir.
Okay, and sir, with respect to a question from Mr. Brock, my understanding is that when the eventual clearing of people was being undertaken, yes, they did it peacefully and they should be saluted. I agree with you on that. But at one point in time, at least one point in time, blockaders attempted to remove a revolver or a firearm from some of the police that were doing the removal. Is that your understanding as well?
I don't have any information on that, Mr. Varani, and sometimes that can be a difficult job, but I think the police did it very well.
Okay, and Ms. Boniface asked you about the difference between the provincial declaration and the federal declaration, and my understanding is that the provincial declaration had no power to deal with trucks that were plated in Ontario or licensed for insurance in Ontario, only in Ontario, but didn't have jurisdiction over trucks that would be plated in Alberta or insured in Alberta, for example. Is that correct?
Thank you. Mr. Fortin, you have 1 minute.
Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Minister, I read the two letters you presented. Manitoba was asking the federal government to take measures, but no one is asking you to invoke the Emergencies Act. You are being asked to help them by providing material and staff to tow vehicles. And when we look at the annex again, there are two provinces that ask for proclamation of the law, Ontario, British Columbia, and Newfoundland. The others said no. So the question I have for you, Mr. Minister, what did you rely on, really, to proclaim the Emergencies Act? The provinces did not want it. The police officers were not asking for it. What were you relying on to decide that you were going to proclaim the Emergencies Act?
Relying on an assessment that a national emergency existed and that it represented a significant threat to the interests of Canadians.
D'où vient l'idée qu'il existe une...
Where did you get the idea that we had that situation?
Well, I was aware that, for example, our borders were being blocked. In Ontario, that was $400 million worth of trade every day. Auto factories were being idled right across the province. Literally thousands of workers were being sent home. And in my opinion, sir, that rises to the level of a national security threat against critical infrastructure, which is manufacturing and transportation.
Mr.
And we needed to act.
Mr. Fortin, thank you. Mr. Green?
Thank you. Minister, can you please provide the committee with any documentation that there were plans to resume the blockades or conduct blockades at other border crossings?
I don't have that documentation. That I was briefed on that. I believe as well, Mr. Green, and
did you receive a briefing document on that?
No, I received a verbal briefing, but I've also read a number of open source reports on the same subject. There was a very sincere and legitimate concern that these blockades would return.
It was a yes or no. Do you believe that the response to the convoy and the occupation in Ottawa was a failure of policing? Yes or no?
I believe it was unsuccessful. That's the language that I would use. It was unsuccessful. They weren't able to resolve it.
Do you believe that your preparation and emergency preparedness was a failure?
I'm well aware of my responsibility, sir, and frankly, making sure that the Ottawa Police Service were effective in their response dealing with the public order event in their city is not my responsibility. But when they ran into difficulty, I did feel a responsibility to help in every way I could.
Thank you, Senator White.
Thank you very much. I got mute this time. Thanks, Minister. Again, I wonder if you could walk through, look, this thing went on for weeks. How difficult it is because I'm not sure the Canadian public understand how difficult it is for police officers to start wearing through the 12, 14-hour day after day after day, and why at some point something has to occur, whether it's the Emergency Act or something else is a discussion we'll have, but something has to happen to alleviate that, and the fact that it was growing and what impact that would have on policing.
Senator, I think it's more than fair to acknowledge that this was an extremely challenging event for all of the officers who were involved here in the city of Ottawa, in Windsor, right across the country. It's a difficult job that we asked them to do. It had gone on for days. I think there is, and we know that the police officers were facing criticism from both sides of that protest, people who were being really significantly impacted, their citizens who they're sworn to protect and serve, as well as the protesters who have, certain rights, but those rights were well exceeded and to the point of criminality. It was a very difficult thing for the police officers to respond to, and I think that part of my conversation, I will tell you, with the police chief in Ottawa was about his concern for his officers and the impact that this event was having on them.
Thank you very much. Final question, Senator Carignan.
I understand that you spoke with the chief of the Ottawa Police Services. and you discussed all the topics you presented, and you did not have any discussion about his plan to free up the city of Ottawa. It's incredible. I have difficulty believing you. You have stated that you did not discuss with the Ottawa Police Services about their plan to unblock Wellington Street.
Police officer for 39 years and a police chief in Toronto, and I know the difference of responsibility. I have great respect for the authority and responsibilities of the police chief.
Vous avez une décision à prendre
and
comme
I know that it's inappropriate for me to advise or direct that police chief in any way. I relied on the briefings that I was receiving from our federal officials, the RTMP, about a plan.
The question is to know, do you have a plan to vacate, to free up the city? And then they would tell you, yes, we have a plan. You take a decision, they tell you, we have a plan. Don't worry, Mr. Minister, we will free up the street.
Judgment on the facts, and the fact was whether or not they had a plan or not, it had proven to be singularly ineffective in resolving the situation peacefully.
So you also watched it on TV?
So, let me take the opportunity, Minister Blair, to thank you for being here and to, on behalf of all members of the committee.
Madam Chair, just a point of order.
Go ahead.
I just want to put on the record in a word I misspoke. I believe the records will show that I insinuated that the Deputy Prime Minister was contemptible. That was not the intended word I wanted to say. I want to apologize for that. It was contemptuous, for the record, almost contemptuous. So rather than have to stand up in the House and do that apology, I just thought I would do that now and allow that record to be corrected. I did not suggest she was contemptible.
Duly noted. Thank you. I'll go back to thanking Minister Blair for joining us, and on behalf of all committee members, we are now adjourned.